Welcome to the Theory of DFS podcast. I'm Jordan Cooper, the co author of The Theory of Daily Fantasy Sports. It's a 15-hour audio DFS masterclass. You can find it at theoryofdfs.com. Join with me is a special guest who on YouTube you cannot see on the screen, but you'll hear in the audio. It's quote unquote Dean, uh, who runs the site sports-projections.com. Also, you can follow him at sports underscore PROJ, who I know a lot of people follow. And I know a lot of people use your site because it's a little bit easier than me using Excel for some showdown analysis. Uh, Dean, quote unquote. The first question I have to ask before we talk about the site and everything that you do is why are you so hesitant on like I don't want to show my face, I don't want to show my real name. Uh, I mean, I know there are some people in the DFS space that prefer to remain anonymous. Is it more because of that, or I mean, some people just don't like putting stuff out in social media and just like nope, I'd rather my Google results be clean.
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of different things. I am the only social media I have is this Twitter account that's not actually associated with who I am. So I think and I am a pretty private person. I think another big aspect is I do have a full-time job, and I don't do DFS professionally or any of that. So want to keep that as separate as possible. Um, and I think that the third reason is also, yeah, I just my I've been playing DFS for quite some time. I'm in my mid 20s, but I've been playing for a good bit of time and have a username that's associated with my actual name. So just trying to keep that all as separate as possible and stay sort of under the radar.
So is it a username that if you were to say it, people would recognize?
Probably not. I play. I primarily focus on some of the smaller sports. Honestly, I don't pretend to be like one of the whales or mega sharks. I primarily play DFS. And focus on some of the smaller sports or even smaller contest type offerings is really what I play and focus on rather than just MMEing week in week out for some of the major sports.
So what are the smaller sports? Are you talking about more the since especially I mean well with sports-projections.com, most people ask me because like, oh, how do you check your dupes in like an MMA contest or a showdown contest? And you can do in Excel. I tend to screw everything up whenever I do stuff in Excel because I'm not the best Excel user, nor do I know Python or anything like that. So uh, it used to be free. Now you charge $7.99 a month. But since I could just write it off as a business expense, $8 a month just so I could plug in my showdown lineups and go like within 60 seconds after a slate and go, okay, I can take a look at that. Is worthwhile to me. Uh, are those the contests that you focus on more? Are you less likely to play like the classic MLB, classic NFL? Are you diving into like F1 or college basketball, or I mean, or are you focused more on there's only 28 things to choose from, and you have to play one at captain, and I'm gonna play a bunch of those types of contests.
Yeah, I think it's really two things. I think one you definitely hit on is the sports and contest types that are highly or where duplication and being unique is important. I think is one set of contests I like to play. So that's stuff like you described, like F1, MMA, NFL Showdown. Even though that's gotten harder and harder over the years since I've been playing, stuff like that, and then a handful of other sports I play where I th- I basically think that there's very little in ways of projections themselves and data where through my data collection or ability to model, I at least think I have an edge. So those are really the two types of things I focus on.
Was sports where like the most available industry projections aren't either they either aren't available or they're in your opinion at least much less accurate.
Yeah, so some examples of those would be college football is one of the biggest ones where uh, data is really hard to come by. I think that's actually how I started my Twitter account was by starting to post like target counts for college football players because that data, while readily available for the NFL, wasn't super available at least at the time for college football. I wasn't able to find it. So that's one sport, and then other ones that are um, either overlooked in terms of modeling, or I think there's opportunities to model better.
So your day job, does your day job involve data analysis or is it completely unrelated?
No, it's quite related. I'm an actuary by
Mm.
is my profession, which if you're not familiar is there's actually I think it's probably one of the professions that attracts the most or most gamblers come from because it's quite similar. It's really pricing uncertainty and quantifying risk. It depends a lot on what you do, but at least that's the type of work I work in is trying to price things that haven't happened yet and what's the probability and costs associated with that.
So do you work for like a financial firm?
I work for a consulting firm,
Okay.
and so we have a lot of different clients and help them with wide variety of subjects. But yeah, it's a mix between sort of finance, math. My degrees in math, statistics, and then sort of computer science, data science.
Okay.
So
So I mean, so you're a nerd like most of the better DFS players.
yeah, I don't know if I'm one of the better DFS players, but I can certainly concur on the nerd. The running joke with actuaries is you how can you tell a social actuary from an unsocial one? Well, the social one looks at your shoes when they're talking to you. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, but I think that's a lot. I mean, I think that would be me to some extent. I think uh, I'm I'm that type of person. Just as if the power dynamic is different, I'm very outgoing. So that's why, like I did stand up comedy for 15 years and acting and improv and was in a band. But it's like those are very defined settings where it's like, no, you're purposefully paying to look at me talk and whatever type of thing. But like in a normal, go out to a bar and there's 50 people there. I'm the person in the corner going, it's too loud in here. No one, you can't talk or people are moving around. I don't want to drink. Can we just go home and watch Netflix?
See that I can't. It sounds like you can at least turn on the social ability. I don't know if I can even turn it on. So you're one step
You're
ahead. It
big
sounds.
social now. This is social, right? Other than
If
the fact that you won't turn on your camera, so like that's
Yeah,
you
I
could be
don't.
looking down at your shoes right now.
Yeah, I think that the whole not sharing the camera really proves my point here.
I started playing DFS October 2015. Did you come on the scene? Or I mean, I know you don't play professionally, but yeah, I mean, profitably at least as a side thing, you do post a lot of stuff on your Twitter account. Uh, were you playing before, like during the beginning of the boom, or because I came on kind of basically once, like a ton of like the late stage of when the commercial blitz was, and me similar to you, I only really followed soccer. So like for the first like year and a half, I just played soccer, and like I don't come from an actuarial background. Like I come from a yes, I was an honors math student. Yes, I was a web developer. Yes, I do marketing analytics. So it's like it's related fields, but not to the point in which like my programming language or scripting knowledge from 2002 ain't gonna really cut it. Like if I wanted to get back to like I have to relearn Perl. And it's like yeah, good luck programming everything in a language where if you type an extra space wrong, everything explodes. That like from your experience, you would have to think that when you started playing DFS, you were realizing things that the field were not. I mean, concepts that probably the most of the industry didn't even know.
Yeah, so like I said, I'm in my mid 20s. So when I started, I think I was either early in college or so. And I was really basically I've only been playing somewhat what I would call seriously for maybe 2 or 3 years at this point. Up until that point, I didn't really have any money to play more than like a handful of dollars. But I was playing somewhat regularly in college and learning, and mostly losing at that point. But it was really sort of the past couple years. Honestly, the pandemic sort of gave me more time than I ever had. One of the things about being an actuary is you have to take many exams throughout the education, and so even your free time, you're taking a lot of time to study for exams. But um, the pandemic gave me a lot more free time to actually sort of build some of the stuff I have now. And that's when I think some of these revelations that you're sort of hinting to came to me, when I actually had time to appropriately model the stuff. I think I was pretty naive early on when I was starting, like, oh, I could build solid NBA projections and then just play that and print. But the reality is, like, uh, I think one of the things that I've learned a lot over the years about DFS is there's a lot more to it. You can't just build a foolproof like math model. For example, for NBA, if you don't have a good systematic way to deal with late swap, for example, or something like that, then you're just going to get wrecked. So, and obviously you could do that on the basis of math, but yeah, I think I've basically probably donated what, 25-30 bucks every weekend, through most of the time I played. But the past 2 to 3 years, I've taken it more seriously, and yeah, have had success since then.
Well, you mentioned the basketball projections. I mean, one of the things I mean, I know that you agree with some things that I say and you disagree with some things that I say. And we're going to get into those because I'm not even sure which is which at this point. But uh, one of the things about like projections is that, like, yes, can I build my own model? Yes. Can I do it as good as you? Probably not. Can I do it as good as most of what the good players, or at least around the industry, can? No. So why am I taking the time? Like, if the edge, like you say, oh, you can't just make the best projections in print, then what is the value of the projections other than a starting point? Other than, well, you need something to determine, well, yeah, Jokic is most likely going to score more points than Wayne Ellington. Like, you're going to need something like that, just so the basics, like the baselines of everything. And if the industry projections around the industry, whatever site you subscribe to, whether or not you do them rudimentary yourself, like, if that isn't going to be like the thing that makes you the money, why would I want to spend the most amount of my time trying to improve what's already available to me, either for free, a lot of times not. If I could pay $40 a month for basketball projections that are as nearly as accurate as anything else you could possibly make, or NFL projections, or just someone else's knowledge that they've already done all of this work, that my accuracy wouldn't be better than theirs, shouldn't I be spending more time on the things that, once you have something that's reasonably there, that's going to provide you so much more edge, because that in and of itself isn't going to do it.
Yeah, so I think I generally agree with you. What I'll say is, the only exception to that, I think, is some of the sports that I play, like I said, where there's bad projections. But
I understand that. I wanted to make the caveat before you answered that.
Right.
Like, when I asked you before about, like,
Yeah.
that's the ones where you don't think that the industry projections are as accurate, right? I'm talking about more in in betting you would call it more liquid markets, right?
Hmm.
Like markets where if you want NFL projections for DFS, there's tons. People may disagree with certain with like target shares or stuff like that. NBA, maybe someone has someone for 30 minutes instead of 32 minutes, but ultimately the models themselves, like once you get like the minutes and usage right, like how much more accurate can they really be? And if you have a choice of four, five, six, even if you aggregate them together, like a lot of times, like that's not much different than taking just one of them to begin with. But in the smaller sport, I can totally understand
Yeah.
that you're playing college basketball and some minor teams or whatever. It just simply putting in baseline projections from even a site like Rotogrinders, which I obviously do shows on, may not be the most accurate than you doing it yourself. But Dean, it's kind of weird. Dean, uh, have you gotten to the point, however, in certain of have you ever experienced in some capacity where you've taken the time and hours to model something that are you comparing that to what you could find around the industry, probably for a subscription price, and go, well, my model either is not as good as that, especially in the major sports, or maybe portions of how certain things, like if instead of maybe you have a better a, a, a better understanding of like the NFL, how the teams are going to play more, but uh, the actual modeling of like how that all simulates out is like you instead of doing that yourself, you'd rather just you know a lot of people in basketball a lot of times just take people's baseline projections and just change the minutes because the model in and of itself of usage and rebound rate and all that type of stuff and kind of is accurate enough that why spend 400 hours to do it either slightly better or not much, like how
Yeah.
much you
Yeah.
can
So
gain from that.
yeah. So I think you're totally right. For the major sports and for the vast majority of people, it's I'm talking like probably 99.99% of people for these sports, it's not worth um, modeling or trying to build projections because they aren't going to be better than what's publicly available. The one thing that building projections, and it depends how you build it, affords you is if you build it sort of from a simulation based approach, even if your projections aren't necessarily as good, one of the things that does tell you is when it's sort of simulation based, you get a lot more information than what the projections are that are just out there. So, for example, um, most projection sets, you have no you basically just have a median or mean projection, but you have no idea how often that person actually ends up in the optimal. Whereas if you build an actual sort of simulation based projection, the actual mean projection might even be worse than what's publicly available. But you have at least some way of estimating optimal rates, which is really much more important than just a mean projection.
But you
So
also,
that
but you also have to consider. I'm gonna push back a little, and then you're gonna clarify, and then I know how this all works. The optimal rates. What I think what people get wrong. I'm not talking about smart people. I'm talking about not smart people. That they'll look at top percentage tools. That those are all also correlated with salary and positional dynamics. That they have a less shot at making the optimal, but because they're a certain position and the strength of that position versus the like in baseball. Well, but baseball's a highly variant sport. But let's say in baseball, like the chances of this cheap pitcher being optimal may be much higher than their ownership. It may be because there's a 7.5 total team in baseball that's all like $5,500 a piece, and the only way, like if the Dodgers and Coors go off for 17 runs and having five of those players in your lineup because they all have like 30 points each, well, the only way to fit those guys in is you can't have the two stud pitchers. So like the stud pitchers will have lower optimal rates and the cheaper pitchers will have higher optimal rates progressively. But like the context of the slate will kind of dictate that, and people will go in and go, well, I think the Dodgers are going to be overowned, and I think these cheap pitchers are going to be underowned. And these three cheap pitchers are actually going to be 2% owned, but they make the optimal 5%, 6% of the time. I'm going to play a bunch of these cheap pitchers together with a stud pitcher, and then play this other stack that is overpriced but underowned. And it's like, well, the combination of all of that isn't the reason why the cheap pitcher's optimal rate is so high. It's because in order to get the Dodgers, you need to play a cheap pitch. Like to me,
Right.
that's the crux of those. Like understanding that as a concept in lineup construction means a lot more than the raw number that you see in even if you subscribe to a site that publishes these based on their sims. Like you can't just go straight by that, or you'll end up getting lineups that are technically really not highly likely to be optimal. It's only because like you're just trying to fit like non-correlative pieces together without realizing that there is a correlation. If the high-price fighter in MMA scores 150 points, the optimal rate of some low-price fighter are all going to go up, because the only way to get that guy is to play a cheap fighter.
Yeah, that's like a perfect example of the second part of why I think building even an imperfect model via simulation could be super useful, because even the sites that do publish optimal rates, they don't really mean anything or mean as much unless you know how those correlate. The MMA example is exactly right. So if you had down from God the optimal rates of every fighter, it would be hard or harder to build lineups if you didn't know the correlations of those optimal. And so when you actually build a simulation, you're able to quantify some of the stuff you're sort of intuitively talking about, like when the highest price fighter goes off, the lower price ones are more likely to be in it. And I think some build rules will just sort of naturally do that because there is a salary cap. But some of the sports are quite complicated, and there's a lot of correlations, and it's hard to actually build those lineups unless you have sort of like a basis of simulating sort of the whole slate and how different fighters or teams or whatever interact with each other. When one player goes off, how does that impact the likelihood of another being in the optimal lineup? And that's really hard to do. I'm not aware of any sort of sites that do that.
Well,
or
I mean,
make it.
if you talk to someone like Whistles Go Woo, I mean, like he doesn't have a site, but I'm saying he's done interviews where, I mean, he perfectly says that he really doesn't do his own projections. But
Yeah, I should have clarified. I meant it's hard to do with what's publicly available.
Right.
I think anybody who's simulating, this is just sort of like a natural byproduct of the sim, because you simulate a slate and build the optimal off of that, or build the top 10 or whatever optimals off of that, and you will just by sort of like the nature of the sim, you'll build in like what is the correlation of every fighter or whatever being in the optimal together, and that's just sort of like a result of your simulation.
Right, because I to use MMA as an example only because it's easier, because there's less to choose from, and there's less correlation as fight wise between the fights. Is that and we'll talk about this some, because I know you do some at some MMA sims that people like. I think the mistake would be, oh, this $7,000 fighter has a way higher optimal rate than what they're most likely going to be owned. I'm going to play them and leave $1,000 on the table, have a $49,000 lineup, so I'm unique, without realizing that the reason why the $7,000 fighter is more likely to be optimal is because there's 9K fighters on the slate that have like 120 plus point scoring potential, and that the 70-point fighter, even at 75 points, when that happens, ends up optimal. But at 75 points, unless you get 320 point scores, ain't gonna be enough. And if you're purposely going, I'm not gonna play any of the fighters that are the most likely to even make those 120-point scores. Like now I'm relying on like 3 fighters. Like you're gonna be relying on some $8,700 guy, some $8,500 guy going, okay, these are the guys that need to not only outscore the 9K fighters, but score high enough that the 7K fighter at the most likely score of 75 is also optimal. And just from pragmatic, just if you watch MMA, the most likely outcome that if 75 points ain't going to cut it at 7,000. If you leave 1,000 on the table, no matter probably even what salary range it's in, and the only reason that you're playing that cheap fighter, like, I'm going to play 2.5 times the field because, so-and-so is 8% owned and there's 16% chance to be in the optimal, but I'm going to fade the 40% owned fighters that are 9K because, yeah, they could score 130 points. Well, I just have to fade them not scoring 130 points. It's like those two facts have to be together in your mind and not separate.
Right. So, I mean, when you ask about projections, I agree that people can add minimal value in terms of like a mean projection. I just don't. You have to have a lot of intuition, like you do, or have been in this doing this for quite some time to come to those conclusions and build that naturally. At least to me, the only way that I can sort of visualize and make sure I'm not breaking some of these rules, and it's hard to know. I mean, you can have good feels on some of these things, but it's hard to know and quantify these things unless you actually simulate them out or looking at someone's sims who have this out. Because, yeah, like you said, a fighter might be optimal 30% of the time, but maybe 25% of the time they're paired with another fighter. And if you're just playing them at 30% and not pairing them appropriately, like those lineups are probably pretty bad. So, it's really important that you're able to actually use sort of like an empirical basis for optimal rates and correlate with optimal rates, because, them within themselves, like I mean, we've talked about and gave a bunch of examples, isn't super helpful.
Right, but I think like Whistles Go Woo, who has a PhD essentially in optimization. I mean, to me, that's what he's doing, where he could like, I could take someone else's projections, right? As long as percentile projection, I'm not just talking about the mean number, and then go simulate that out and then find where those things lay, because this is something where people will look at you funny. They'll look at you funny and then go, well, I'm going to, you've mentioned it before. People think I'm just going to get the best projections, press the button and print, right? And especially like in cash games, maybe that's possible, right? In double ups, 50-50s, head-to-heads, maybe. You have a slight ROI. But they're like, the top mistakes I see are people that I'm going to subscribe to X site. They have the best projections or whatever they think. I'm going to press 150 lineups and just give me 150 lineups. And it's like, well, you're probably going to lose. It's like, well, I thought they have the best projections. It's like, well, it's not just the projections. And then they go, oh, well, they have the best simulations. And they give you these simulated outputs. And you're like, okay, so all I have to do is type in those simulated outputs and press the button on the optimizer. And it's like, nope, you're gonna be unprofitable that way also. And then people look at you and go, well, if I have one and I have the other, how come you can't just press a button? And it's like, because DFS is so much more of a complex game than just seeing the outputs. Just like most people know, at least smart people know, that what you're seeing in a projection, I mean, the dumb people don't, because I have to argue with them all the time. Where the Dean, I can't believe I still have to call you Dean, whatever. Where I have to argue with someone on a baseball, in a Major League Baseball, where someone it has a projection of 12 and then goes 0 for 4 with like a walk and has 2 points, and they go, oh, projection was off. It's like, the mean projection was 12. Like the mean, no one's predicting that they're going to actually score 12. That is the 50th percentile outcome in a range of like obviously this is stuff that's in the core. This is basic statistics. But a lot of DFS players, casual ones especially, don't understand that. But I think people move over to this simulation aspect where they're not running simulations themselves. They're just seeing raw output on a player by player basis, and they're viewing it, I think, as we described, in a very similar way, where, oh well, this guy, this pitcher, 24% in the optimal, and they got and he actually beats his mean projection by 5 points, and ends up not in the optimal only because he's just too expensive, and either some expensive team went off, or it's a cheap player, like a lot of times. Oh, $7,600 pitcher with the X% in the optimal, and then the Pirates at 2K apiece go off for 12 runs, and although that pitcher puts up 22 points, which is great for that salary, but the 10K, 11K pitchers put up 28 and 32, which is not, for the price, not great, but that's the most points you could get a pitcher. The Pirates stack did what, like, that's what made that optimal. Like, I know we're kind of harping on the same thing over and over again, but I think it's a very, very important point that simulation output can be misinterpreted the same way that median projections are.
Yeah, and it's not, at least to me, very easy to determine what the next step is, even when you have a simulation output. So, like if taking MMA, for example, you can simulate all the fights and have, this is the this is the lineup that's optimal, most likely, and go down a list. But, what you wouldn't want to do is just play like the top 150 of those, right? So the things that I think, like the whistles and the best players are really good at is how to optimize based off of, like the actual simulation results, and optimize for the contest that they're in. I think I tweeted, this at you a week or two ago, but simulating like the results of sporting events is not that hard, comparatively to actually simulating what to do with those outcomes in terms of like a DFS contest, and because it's very dependent on what the field is going to look at, and that is a much more complicated problem, at least for me at this time, than actually simulating. Like, MMA is particularly simple, but even some of the more complicated sports, what is harder to do is come up with how to use the simulated results of the sporting events to the actual contest, and what you do there.
Well, I mean, the problem with contest, because you're talking about contest simulations, is that it's not that difficult to simulate contests after the fact, right?
Oh, that's the easy part.
Right, that's the easy part, because you have all the lineups. If you're gonna play an MLB contest with 30,000 entries, and it's like, oh well, now I played my one, or a 150 or whatever amount. I played my one, and then there's 30,000 others, and I know the exact ownership, and ownership works the same way. Like all what we're talking about here with the optimal rates is also the same with ownership. That the reason why this guy is more owned is because that guy is more owned, right? Because it's a salary and position dynamic, and I talk about this in the course conceptually, but that also matters for everything else that you do. So like, once you have the contests, like then you could as long as obviously your projections are going to be biased towards yourself. So most likely you're going to have the highest EV because that's what you're basing it on.
Yeah, every week.
Right.
All this theoretical EV hasn't been realized quite yet, but
right. But in order to actually utilize that, you have to predict those lineups to begin with, right? Because you can't just, I'm going to be able to see what everyone else is going to play, and then I put in my lineups. So what you're describing is that's the hard part of like simulating the contest, which is much better than simulating just the sports performances. But how do you go about doing that? Because you almost have to, if you take ownership projections from around the industry, they're going to be highly variant. You may not even agree with their methodologies. And if you're off by a couple of percentage points on a couple of players, like that could dramatically change Like it's one of those snowball effects that, like, if you have this guy at 20, we'll use MMA as an example because it's smaller. Uh, if you have a 9K fighter, if you have the most expensive fighter on the slate at like 38% owned, and he comes in at 46, like that just means a lot of the 7,000, 6,900, 7,100, like all of those fighters are going to be more owned. And then the guys that are like 9,400, 9,300, 9,200 be slightly less owned. And like, that's just one fighter. Like, if you're off on some mid-range fighters by 2, 3, it sounds so little, like 2, 3, 4%. But now all of a sudden, certain build constructions work out that a lineup that you thought was going to be unique is now duplicated 3 or 4 times. And a lineup that you thought was going to be duplicated 3 or 4 times is now unique. And the optimal rates of the lineups start changing because, oh, I didn't realize so many more people were going to play a barbell build versus a mid-range build versus a 2.9K build versus how owned is the main event going to be? Hey, how many times do we see the main event getting stacked in large fields? 0.4% of that, like, if you're off by not, it sounds marginal. Like, if you're off by point something, probably you're good enough. But if you're off by, there are many times, many slates where I'm off on 1 or 2 fighters by over 5% in ownership. And typically it's because I didn't think they were going to be as highly. It's typically the higher standard deviation fighters on ownership, meaning the fighter that no one wants to play in the 9K range. Well, how much does no one want to play them? Is it going to be 8% owned or is it going to be 12% owned? And the same thing on the bottom end, like the biggest underdog. Is he going to be 4% owned or 7% owned? And it sounds weird, but those are the ones that you have to get right most importantly, not the ones where the guy's going to be, I think he's going to be 36% owned and he comes in at 35 or 34 or 38. And he's in a range where if you're off by 2%, you're probably not changing many of what lineups look like.
Right, because a low percentage. I mean, someone going from 1 to 2% is doubling, right? The number of lineups that they're in versus 35 to 37 is very minorly as a percentage of what was you expected to be there, increasing. So yeah, I mean it's right. This is the hard part of DFS to me is once you have the outcomes, what do you actually play based on that? And MMA is one of the better sports, I think, for this to talk about because it's by far, to me, one of the most simplest, just because you don't have correlation between fighters, really, besides the ones that are fighting. And so,
you also don't have the captain slot as well, so you reduce the amount of lineup combinations.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, what I generally do is I try and I simulate out a Slater contest or whatever, come up with the ones that I think, so then I'd have what's most likely to be, optimal being somewhat, another important thing to mention here is when I'm saying optimal, I'm talking about being truly the highest scoring, available. Yeah. Right. But, and that, some people might have issue with this, but, for MMA, it's to me a pretty good proxy because the majority of the time it's close to the optimal as the winning lineup. Another reason why sports like MLB or NFL or something are hard to me to solve is because if you don't want to be playing anything close to your quote unquote optimal from sims, because if you run 10,000 sims, the optimals are always going to be probably like unstacked, just crazy lineups that don't make any sense really to play. And so optimal, is different in a sport where the winner is very likely to be like the actual highest scoring lineup. It becomes more complicated in sports where that's not the case. But
right,
yeah, I mean,
just to clarify, in MMA, most likely, more times than not, the best possible lineup is the winning GPP lineup in a large field contest. Occasionally get the second optimal or third optimal, but even in the Millie Maker in the NFL, you put 400, 500,000 entries in, the best possible lineup may be 30 or 40 points higher then what wins the $1 million. So imagine how many lineups are if the winning Millie Maker lineup is 237 and the optimal is 267. So there's 30 points in between. You know how many combinations that you can make but from 30 points? I mean, the winning lineup in the Millie Maker is probably not in the top 100,000 optimals. It's just that those optimals is some random 3K guy that scored a touchdown in the dying minutes of a like guys that are either 0.1% or less owned or completely uncorrelated messes. MLB 15 game slate. Like
Yeah.
the winning the best possible lineup is going to have like 260 270 points, and you'll see the large field GPP the winner has 215, right? Because like you don't need to score the best possible lineup, you just need to score the highest out of what is realistically going to be played. But in MMA and even to a lot of extent NFL Showdown, NBA Showdown, the very limited amount of lineup combinations, most likely you're aiming for what's the nut lineup, right? In Millie Makers, like if you were to truly go, I want to aim for the nut lineup, you'd be playing MLB, you'd be playing, I mean, God knows what. I mean, even if you went by your Sims, and also, even if you were to try that, 10,000 Sims wouldn't even be enough for that, right? You probably need, I don't even know, I wouldn't even gather so many that it would be maybe not even possible to even do.
Yeah, and MLB is another good example where it's clear that you're not trying to build for like the actual true highest scoring lineup. Because if you just look at some of the top players, I think how they play their pitchers. If you simulated out all the pitchers on like a 12 game slate, the lower projected pitchers are always going to be quote unquote under owned to their optimal. But very few of the top players will actually be overweight on those because I think for the most part they're building around more so sort of like optimal stack rates, and then filling in pitchers from there, to sort of get the most highest dollar or highest projected pitchers from there. So it's a very different problem, and like I said, to me, one is much easier to solve than the other because in a sport like MLB, it's very dependent on what the field is going to do. Again, it goes back to sort of like simulating out what like how owned people are going to be. Whereas in MMA, the decisions to me are really more like how often is this lineup going to be optimal and how often is it owned, and making a decision that way, which is different than the optimal definition in say MLB, where it's like optimal for the contest rather than just like highest scoring.
Right, because we'll see a lot of times, I mean, on slates, let's say it's a 14 game MLB slate, and the winning lineup of the large field GPP has, like on FanDuel, even better, has one of the two top projected pitchers in it. Even though they were like the 6th and 7th highest scoring pitcher on the slate, because there's a guy there's the highest pitcher on the slate was 0.4% owned. Now, in order to be the winning GPP lineup, you had to play that guy and then still get everything else right. And there just aren't that many lineups with that guy in it that you're not going to have to worry. A lot of times you're just not going to. Sometimes it ends up being that way. So, yeah, I guess so. But like on DraftKings, you have to play 2 pitchers. A lot of times, the winning GPP lineup will, especially since pitchers are less variant, will contain 2 somewhat owned pitchers, and it comes down to the question, like how I could tell if someone understands statistics or someone that thinks they understand statistics to a layperson, right? I teach a lot of more beginner to intermediate players, where I'll ask someone will be really owned. I'll see this in the Roto-Grinders Discord sometimes. Some pitcher or some fighter or something will be ridiculous. Some basketball player, right? Especially in basketball, right? Where Some guy could be 4K and project for God knows how much. And they'll be, just let's use an extreme example, they'll be 90% owned. And then someone will say to me, they don't have a 90% chance of being in the optimal lineup. And I go, you're absolutely right. But they're most likely going to be in the winning GPP lineup. And they go, well, what happens if they get injured? I said they're still more likely to be in the winning GPP lineup. And they go, and they go, how is that possible? And I go, because 90% of the lineups have him in it. Like if there's 100 entries in this contest and 90 have this player in it, like even if he scores a 0, one of those 90 lineups is still possibly has a decent sized chance of winning the 100-man contest against the 10 lineups that don't have a 0 and just don't get enough points. So like the sheer amount of lineups that are in the contest will raise these rates also. Obviously it's more likely, like there's a difference between the optimal lineup and the winning lineup. So like a guy could have like, he's going to be twice as owned as what he's going to appear in the optimal. Yeah, but he's also most likely going to be in the winning lineup only because he's high. It's like it's that paradox of two, and a lot of people don't like get that after that. And this comes into the under-owned, over-owned type of thing, where it's quite possible that a player that is over-owned is still more beneficial in your lineups than not playing them, only due to that the sheer amount of lineups that have them in it, and you can't make certain combinations without them. Like it's not one of these type. It's not MLB with a one-off and there's 14 games on the slate. I'm talking about more for the PGA showdown, like maybe not small field PGA, MMA, NFL showdown, where it's like, well, either play this over-owned guy or who else are you going to play in order to make this combination. Let's say you already have a combination that's unique, but I'm playing this over-owned guy. It's like, why wouldn't you play that? You're already unique, and you're playing a guy that is over-owned, less likely to be optimal, but he's also the highest projected player at that spot. Are you purposely going to lose projection because of? I mean, like to me, these are the. To me, this is what I believe. You have to have the mindset of thinking conceptually. Like you're doing stuff. Obviously, you understand these concepts, but you come from them from the bottom up, and I come from the top down. Going like, I think I could get to where you are just by really intuitively understanding a lot of these concepts, and then kind of being directionally accurate enough, kind of hacking stuff together, and then getting similar plus EV lineups. And then there's also a lot of people on the bottom that I talk to that are like, I didn't even realize these concepts existed. It's just that's what the simulations spit out. And like that, like I talked to Nerdy Tenor, he goes, a lot of times I don't even know why these lineups are more profitable until he looks at them and goes, well, these lineups actually adhere to a lot of the concepts that I talk about. And he gets to them like the bottom up way. So sometimes I like the fact that other people like you figure stuff out, and I go, okay, that makes sense with what I conceptually understand. So it's like I'm not crazy because I can't reproduce what you're doing. All I could do is go, well, I'm going to play this way, and I'm going to play this way for a long time, and apparently I'm profitable doing this. So I think the concept makes sense. And then you make these little rudimentary sims in Excel, and you go, okay, you do it the exaggerated way. Like, let's just have a contest that it's a 100-man contest, and 99 people have the same lineup, right? And then I just change my lineup. What happens if I play this lineup, then that lineup, then the lowest projected lineup? How often do I win like that? And then you go, well, if that's true, well, what happens if 98 people have the same lineup? What happens if and then you scale it down and you go, well, this variable obviously has an effect. I'm not the best at precisely what
that's what I was going to say.
Right.
That's what I was going to say. So I mean, that's really right. The added benefit is I was watching your stream earlier today, and you were talking about 3-mans, I think, and what is the line of like how far off optimal you want to play if two people have very similar lineups. and you intuitively understand like you want to play different, but without actually simulating it yourself, it's hard to know like what is actually the optimal strategy. Like, do I play 1 point and share three guys, or only have three guys different? Do I have to play 2 points off and have six guys that are different? What is actually like the best point? And that is really, that type of answer you could really only answer like, with an actual simulation. So
But those are
I don't
but
just
those are fairly easy. But those are a little bit easier simulation problems, at least for me, to
the
do.
fewer the people, yeah, certainly. And that's why um, a lot of what I play and focus on is smaller field, like yeah, under 15 people, where in sports where you have a really good idea of what um, the field, quote unquote, because it's so small, is going to play, because it's much easier than to it's hard to build what an entire contest is going to look like. It's much easier to assign probabilities to what two or three people are going to play, and then come up with optimal solutions off of that.
And I think that even my directionally accurate strategy for the three mans, I think it's more of figuring out what's optimal. But I think anything that I think most of what I could do, even if I'm off, is still profitable.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that example you were showing today, where they're playing a 1v1 and you're playing something entirely different. I don't do MLB projections or anything, so assuming you were, in the neighborhood of their projected lineups, yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly correct.
Right. I showed that extreme example on the stream on purpose because, but the whole point on purpose to go, here's the most extreme that's not a duplicated lineup. Because we could all agree that if they were duped completely, like I win.
Hmm.
Like I could probably lose a lot of projection even more. The most amount, like if they're duped completely, I could have the lowest, like for them to reach equilibrium with me, I would have to sacrifice so much more projection for them to be break even because they don't even win. They only split X amount of the time against one single line. I mean that's how you would have collusion to some extent. But if that's the case, then if they're off by a 1v1, that still has to apply with the 9 other people in their lineup also. Right? So like there's going to now the project if for instance, if they have a dupe lineup, if I simulated out a duped lineup and I go, I'm profitable anywhere up to a median projection, even though that's a little blunt, of 12 points underneath them. Like if I go past 12, they still win too much of the time that they could still see profit from it, and I will lose equity. But at 12, we break even. At 11, I'm profitable. At 10, I'm more and I get even more. And obviously, as I get closer to their lineup, my line should actually start to come down now, right? Because now we're going to be sharing more players, and we're going to be splitting more often to each other. So there's going to be some line there where you go from not profitable to the most profitable, then down to little less, little less, little less, and then if you dupe them, obviously in DraftKings you get the rake back, so it'll end up being even. But let's say if you count the rake and you have to pay it, like all three of you are unprofitable. Like there has to be a line, an equilibrium of that. There has to be some line where, on average, obviously everything's slate dependent. But then what happens when they're off by a 2v2 or they're off by a 3v3? Like, is it better, for instance, to not play? If I could not play the lineups that the players that they both share, do I mind playing a lineup with a player that one of the players have? Or would it be better off if I didn't share any of the players? Like to me, those those are the problems I find interesting. Of like that's simulating like what would be the line, but in realism, I don't mind playing with real money while doing this because I believe intuitively that even though I'm not at that optimal point on that curve, possibly, I'm somewhere around it that I'm still making money regardless. But intellectually and probably financially too, I want to find out what the fucking line is.
Yeah, no, what you're saying totally makes sense, and yeah, my point was that the simulation can kind of find that point, or you could do it, you know, try and find it in sort of empirically as you're doing, through just being in the contest. The problems, um, as they become more complicated, right? So, let's say you have someone playing the optimal and someone playing something, doing basically what you're doing, playing something closely optimal but entirely different. Now, what would your optimal strategy be there? Is it profitable for you to even play it? I've run into different three mans or four mans, different contests where you could be pretty certain that someone's going to play something, and basically your options are um, play something else and you're negative to them, or play that and you're obviously negative to them. So basically they're sort of, it's sort of like a game of chicken, and your options, there's really no profitable way to play the
Right.
contest potentially.
Right.
So
I mentioned it. You watched the stream. I was talking about that on this. Like, one guy enters, and it's like, if uh, that's why I'm sitting there going, I'm going because I'm looking at what's actually happening. I have 7 days worth of data, and I'm taking out that data, and I'm looking at like different types of things, and especially on FanDuel, because I think it's a little bit softer. I'm finding people that are the third guy in three mans, or the fourth and fifth people in five mans, that are playing awful lineups, that are just playing lineups that are like, way, like, even if you if I would surmise, I'm gonna try simulating in Excel. I'm gonna see what their lineup compares to if played against two sharper players that only have like a 2v2 or a 3v3, and see their lineup is like 13, 14 points off. But maybe against a 2v2 against two sharps, they're actually the most profitable lineup in the context. The line is that far down because of it. And then if that's the case, my lineup, like, if that guy is 14 points lower, and I know the top one is playing the quote optimal or something, like, should I be playing that? Let's say there was a line there that if that guy is 14 and the other one has the 0, if I play -3, I become the most profitable lineup, and it's in that contest. But in another contest, the three man, if I play against two people that have 14-point lower projections, and I play the optimal, what's my so against the two really bad players, and then what's the profit of if I play the two sharpest players that are playing the optimal and a 2v2, and I play one like 3 or 4 points lower? It's quite possible, simulating those three instances, that the most profitable situation to be in is to play against the two best players on the site, quote unquote.
yeah, if they're playing something so similar, again, it's hard to answer. This is why I'm so in favor of simulating and doing your own projection, because it's so hard to actually answer these things, um, without actually running it. And one of the
But Dean, I think it's important. Like, you're trying you're in the second stage. Like, I'm at your stage now. I'm at how do I solve the problem? But would you agree that 99% of people that play DFS, right, outside of nerds like us, aren't even thinking of aren't even thinking of the problem. Like,
yeah, no,
aren't even understanding, oh, we the common, like, they go from these are the stages. They go from, oh, I'm gonna go play head to heads, right? They go, okay, we're talking about this type of level. We're not talking about GPPs. We're talking more cash game ish. So they go, okay, I'm gonna get the bat projections for MLB, and I'm gonna play the bat optimal in head to heads, and I'm just gonna try to find the worst players, right? Which, to me, is a profitable strategy. Go find three man, basically go and bum hunt, right? Poker term, right? You find players with no badges, but how many of those can you find, and what stakes can you find them in? Do you want to battle for the lobby for people that could possibly take? I mean, there's another step for that, and it's like, okay, I'm just going to play what I believe is the optimal lineup and find anyone that could play me for twice my money, right? For 1.8x or whatever with the rake, or 2x, play double ups, and just hope other people make mistakes. I just need to find more people that make mistakes than me. But then those people then also go, I'll play three mans and go, that not maybe the best. I'll also throw this in a single entry line. Now that may not be the best lineup for that. And then they don't realize what they're doing wrong. Or they'll throw it into triple ups and go, nope, that's not the best for triple ups. Or they'll go, well, what the second stage now, this is once you get to the projection standpoint. Of course, 95% of people that are casually playing DFS don't even know what the fuck projections are. So then once you get to this point, what ends up happening, this happens a lot in NBA, is that you'll go on FanDuel in a 100-man 50-50, and especially on a slate where there's like multiple injured players and obvious mispricings, and see 62 people with the same lineup. And 44 people with the exact same lineup, and then go, is it profitable and what will inevitably happening, even like on a 40-way lineup in a 100-man 50-50, that 40 train will go right past the cash line, like in the middle. And then instead of like in a double up, instead of going from 5 to 10, you go $5 to $6.68. And then people will say to you, is it profitable to play? If everyone's going to be playing the same lineup in a 50-50 type of scenario or head-to-heads, which you'll get the rake back, is it profitable to do so? Should I be playing the second, right? Not many people get to that point. To me, it seems like such obvious thing. Most people go from, I'm going to get projections, I'm going to play head-to-heads, I'm going to play the optimal, and then when they get so many ties, they're like, how do I block the people that play the same lineup? Instead of thinking in terms of, how do I exploit the people that I know that are going to be playing the same lineup? Like, they don't think, like, even in 50-50s, playing the second optimal is not, the duplication benefits in 50-50s are even. It literally doesn't matter what you do. Now, when the rake is involved, once you get to like 45 lineups being duped, right? Now your option isn't not to change your lineup. You're correct. Your optimal choice is to just simply not play the contest, not to play a lineup that's worse than it, just to be different. Once you get into progressive contest, now it pays to be different, but that adheres to the leverage concept of what GPPs are. Relative value, finding points that other people aren't getting. But so many people don't go, like, dude, there's so many people that halfway through an NBA season are like, I'm quit playing cash. Everyone's playing the same lineup. Should I be, and then they purposely are like, should I be playing a worse lineup just to be different? And it's like, oh, you so don't get the concept. Like if you just thought the other way around, you'd open yourself up to a lot more things, which involve the good GPP strategy, with like all the other concepts of DFS exist from the opposite side of that mentality. And so many people don't get there.
I think that it's really hard, though, for a casual player to deal with the actual variance that it would take to ever realize that. I think there's probably a ton of survivorship bias in DFS, like people who win early and stick around, because the variance in these large field contests is just absurd. If you ever sim out even someone who has an edge, I mean, anybody who's played for an extended period of time in these contests knows this. There's occasionally pros will tweet out their roto trackers and talk about some of the downswings, but there's just no possible way that someone who's not grasping sort of the concepts that you're talking about, to me, could ever stick around for some of the swings unless they hit very early, right? So I'm sure there are many people who the reason they're in DFS today is just really because they won early and had a lot of time to sort of learn over that time and get better. I think that's a big part of it. I mean, the other thing I wanted to say on the cash game thing is I see people posting screenshots or talking about, like, oh, look at this fish who played this awful lineup in a head-to-head, because it's different than them. The one thing that is also valuable about having your own projections that are simulation based is you can actually see how often you win. And I think people say like, oh my wow, my lineup is projected whatever 4 points higher than theirs. That might be within the deviation of where you're losing to the rake,
Right,
depending on the
right.
sport. So like in some sports that are highly variant, like I haven't done this, but like say for baseball or football, I'm guessing you have to be considerably higher, to actually make money over the rake in any sort of like head-to-head contest. So, that's another thing is you might be thinking you're playing well and have this big advantage, but you don't actually necessarily know because you don't know how profitable being 1 point or 2 points three is unless you actually have some way of quantifying that.
Right. I mean, even I mean, I've told people. I said, as if you were to play, like, I would say my best sport is soccer out of all the sports. I mean, there's a lot of sharp cash players in soccer that will lose out to the rake if anything. But even in soccer, if I say I'm the best on a normal size slate on a 4 or 5 game soccer slate, if I were to play a head to head against a random person, I'm going to choose soccer compared to, and I mean it could be any sport, but like dude, at as long as they put in players that are starting and they use up most of their salary cap, like I'm like maybe at best a 70% favorite against them. I mean like which is a great edge, a nice 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1 edge, which I'll shove in all the time with that. I mean, like in poker, you'd shove with those edges. You're gonna still lose like a third of the time or a quarter of the time, and that's against the worst. Like someone that is literally, if you in basketball, right, where the variance is low and the production is very close tied to salary, uh, and on an efficient slate, right, with no injuries or anything like that, or even on a baseball, if we say that the market is more efficient, like you see I see pseudo sharp people. I call them pseudo sharps. People that think they're smart argue for uh, sharper pricing, sharper salaries. And I never understand that because if they were perfectly sharp, everyone would lose to the rake because as long as you used all your salary, you'd have the same lineup as anyone else if the salaries were perfectly efficient. Now, on a day to day basis, you don't know what's going to happen, but over the long run. So when I tell people, it's like, dude, anyone that uses $50,000 in salary in a sport that uses starters, right, that are actually going to play, uh, and there's no obvious mispricings, I can't I can't see them ever being. You're not going to beat the like. How are you beating the rake even? How are you beating 10% rake even on that? And people that don't understand that go, no, I thought in head to head you'd win 90% of the time. It's like no one wins 90% of the time. I would have to be playing against people that put in injured players and people that are not starting or people, whatever. I mean, like no one is that big of a dog in those scenarios. And the same applies to like GPPs where especially on large slates in highly variant sports, it's like, dude, you could possibly simulate out like hundreds of thousands lineups that are profitable. That on certain days are going to not win and certain days going to win a lot. And they're if everyone is playing to some reasonable extent, right, where they're not playing injured substitutes in MLB, they're only get one at bat relief pitchers or something. It's like even if you use all one-offs and you're using all of your salary and there's no obvious price mistakes, right? So everyone's 50K is kind of 50K. It's hard to build a bet. It's hard to build a significantly worse lineup than someone else. So like that's what you mean by the variance of like the margins of the difference between a good player and a great player in DFS is not that dramatic. The difference between a bad player and a break even player is not that dramatic. The difference between a bad player and a great player could be enough to be profitable, but there aren't that many horrific players where just being break even would be even worth playing. We're a lot of what we're playing in DFS we're playing a 30,000 field GPP, and 26,000 of the lineups are, dude, anyone got a shot. Let's see what comes up first. Like any one of us is close enough that why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably one of the things that we, at least in the past, seem to have disagreed with. This line of reasoning is, I think, why I'm probably more bearish on DFS long term than you, because as that number continues to go up and approaches, entire contests playing at least well enough that they can't be exploited over the rake. Everybody's just going to lose to the rake, and as soon as
But
the
hold
top.
on a second. So, do you at least agree with with what I'm describing? At least the fact that 80%, like 80% of the lineups in a specific contest are more or less very similar EV to each other.
Uh, so what's actually I actually posted about this yesterday in MMA. I had never really looked at this, but what it actually, at least in MMA, is there are the EV is dominated by a few very high EV lineups.
Yeah, but
It's
just not to cut you off again, because if you listen to the
I,
podcast, you
I
know I do
I
it all
was
the time.
prepared. I was
You were
prepared.
prepared,
I was prepared.
only because
Yeah.
clarified. I'm not this. I want to separate this from MMA, because what I'm talking about is more the classic slates where duplication is not that big of a factor. Where, oh, you're gonna play this line, this stack with that stack, or NFL line. Like, I'm because in MMA, I don't want to. A lot of that profitability comes to not what's most likely, but what's also less duplicated. MLB doesn't really have that.
Yeah.
I never play MLB going, I need to check how many dupes this is going to have. Maybe on a 2-game slate, but like on a 12-game slate, like you're not, like the profitability, the duplication factor is not going to be anything. So that's what I'm talking more about. The reason why I believe MMA has so much more of an edge is because of what you're going to explain. Is because
Mhm.
in MLB, in a 30,000 entry contest, there's going to be like 4,000 lineups that are like really you shouldn't be playing, and then like 26,000 lineups are left, and maybe 2,000 of those 26,000 are decently. You'd rather be playing those lineups, and maybe there's 2,000 on the bottom end of that 26,000 that you're break even at best, but then like in the middle, like 2/3 of the lineups are like they're slightly profitable only because of these the barbell effect, but like the differences between them are not that dramatic, and they all look kind of different. But in MMA, you don't get on MMA. To me, my if you did the same thing, I would theorize that in a 30,000 field contest, I think 26,000 are the negative EV lineups.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I agree with your general premise. I think the vast majority of lineups in any contest, again, not having looked at other sports besides MMA, probably are hover slightly negative EV, and then there's a smaller proportion that is probably slightly positive EV when you take into account the rake. But they're all, for the most part, generally hovering around zero. Is probably, I mean, even in the curve for MMA, that's true. There's most of the lineups, even from winning players, are right around zero or slightly negative with the rake. The winning players, I think, are just able to submit, like more of the good lineups, right? So, yeah, I agree with your general premise that uh, there are way fewer people who are. There's not many people who are just like pure drawing dead in DFS anymore, at least in my opinion. In most of the major contests, most people are at least putting in lineups that are um, reasonable and have similar equity to whether that be, even if that's negative, equity to most of the other lineups in the contest. And yeah, I mean that's what I was getting into of why I think it's just going to become harder and harder. As people become better and better, and without the rate going down, eventually, I see a world where people are there's not enough people left who are putting in bad lineups that that are paying the winners basically. And once that happens and the winners go, the big players stop playing, I think it quickly could fall apart.
But I'm not as bearish because I think in the major sports there's enough bad. There's
NFL
still
might
way too much.
NFL's
Yeah,
probably the
NFL. Come on,
exception.
there's way
Yeah,
too many bad
NFL's probably
guys.
the exception. But I mean, I don't know. I haven't been playing some of these major sports for that long, but it seems like they're decreasing in popularity. I don't know if that's true, but
Now, what
um,
they will what DraftKings will say, because I've seen some things from DraftKings. People misappropriate like popularity with like active users, and obviously a lot of stuff they're doing with the sports book. DFS has grown over the past 3 years. It's grown in user base, but not in frequency. So when you say when the people we're talking about, you can't most people can't conceptualize because they're the single lineup, they're the two line, they're the infrequent players that play often enough but not frequent enough. Like it's someone that there's enough people in the United States or in the world, but in the United States that on a given night of NBA are gonna get home from work and build three lineups. They may not play tomorrow or the next day. They may not play for another 5 days, right? They may build a lineup here. They may play it in this contest. They may like they're not building 150. They're not building even 20. They're building a handful of lineups and sweating the games. But there's tons of those people. And then on different days, different people play. Like it's like 20% of the field is that type of player. That if you ask them, have you ever heard of roto grinders? They go, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, right? Which is the oldest site, obviously, but you could say Awesemo or Stochastic or whatever. Name content sites, name Adam Levitan, ETR, Adam, and name for football, and they go, I don't, I watch NBA and I have fun playing the games. I mean, like, there's a lot more of those people than you think. And you're not going to see the same username over and over again because they're not playing like every day, every slate, or anything like that. Now, for the cash games, for 50-50s and double ups, I think that's dead. I think
yeah, my concern is that those people, they just are going to get wrecked so quickly that it's going to be you're going to have to keep bringing them in, right? Like I don't see those people necessarily lasting because when their money is going to go so much further sports betting than it would say entering like an NBA GPP, and I think they're going to quickly realize that and stop playing. So if you can have an infinite flow of those people, I'm sure some of that flow has come from sports betting and people getting into that for the first time and saying, I'm going to try out this DFS. But if they deposit $100 and play DFS, for a week and just get wrecked, but can play for 2 months sports betting, like eventually, the casuals dollar and most people's dollar, they would be so much better off betting on sports than playing DFS for the
you're
vast
you're
majority of people.
you're thinking too rationally. People aren't rational.
People just want to get wrecked.
No, they don't want to get wrecked. I know when I know I will be bearish on DFS. I mean, this is. I mean, this is my long term plan. Uh, DFS compared to sports betting is the only thing that adheres to what casual people want to do. Take a small amount of money and make a lot of money. Okay? Now, I know you could make a 16-leg single game parlay and try to whatever the
Yeah,
fuck.
that's what I'm saying. They already,
No,
I mean, these
but people,
companies
no, no,
know
no,
that.
no. People know. Here's the difference between DFS and sports betting. Also, because I talk to casual people, and that I play DFS because they every once in a while a friend or something will DM me or text me. They know that a 16-leg parlay is minus. They know they're throwing their money away. DFS, it makes it feel like I'm competing against other people, and I think I know the sport better than others. I'd like to put $10 to possibly win 50,000. Putting $10 to win 50,000 in a parlay, they know is a long. They know that it's against on the book. They know they're doing it purely for entertainment, but they much rather feel like they have a better shot, and DFS offers that. Now, the small to big. Now, if you're actually looking at return money ROI and have the least negative ROI, yes, you're absolutely right. Sports betting, but that will change when more states legalize sports betting and we get liquid uh, multi-state markets on sports betting parimutuel games, meaning that put $10 in. Pick the simplest version is like a contest where it's 14 NFL games. Here are the spreads. You got to pick. You got to pick. You got to pick all the winners, right? You put in $10 to win 100,000. Now, obviously, just like salaries, the spreads aren't going to change. They ain't changing. So, like, if the line moves, right? If Mahomes is out and the Chiefs were a 9-point favorite and now they're a 4.5-point favorite, well, it's still -9 in this contest. And so many people are going to be picking the other side. So maybe the Chiefs will only be 13% owned. Like now we're starting talking about now it becomes a peer-to-peer contest
I
in
know
that
this
dynamic.
idea has. I know, yeah. I mean, this idea has obviously been probably around since DFS, and I think some of these like prop sites have stuff like this.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm not super optimistic that these are going to ever grow to something big because from the sportsbook's perspective, like I don't know what the benefit of offering something like that as opposed to offering
Oh,
just these same game parlays are,
no,
right? Because
that you have
it
no
costs
risk. No,
more.
no, no. You have no risk. Dude, the DFS is profitable because they're taking 10 to 15% off with they have zero risk. They don't have to price anything. It's just as if it wasn't for the fact that UIGA forces them to post guaranteed prize pools, they just scale it up just like a poker contest with a percentage, 40% to 30% to first. They wouldn't even have to worry about overlay. And it's like as long as we they don't care who wins. They don't have to have any type of like, dude, we just get 15% of everything. Like in same game parlays, their holds are much higher, but it's not the largest percentage of their business. And there's still a risk, and they still have to price everything better. They have to get all the correlations right, and they have to hope to get the biggest idiots to bet. But how much money can they? $5 here, $3 there on single game parlays, where the risk management of that is so much. Wouldn't they much rather we have all these lines, and no matter what, I mean, that's the whole point of the VIG, right? It's like, oh, we want even action on both sides, and we'll take a nickel in the middle. It's like, what happens if you took 15 cents on everything and never had to price anything? Like, wouldn't that be so much more worthwhile? It may not be the bulk of their business, but imagine running a Millie Maker. We're doing every week. There's a Millie Maker in NFL Pick'em, and all you have to do is pick the. I mean, this is the most basic form of this type of contest. That would be easy for someone to understand, but it could be sides and total. You have to pick 8 sides and totals, spreads, and something that's even -110 on both sides, and you just have to pick 8 of them, right? And it's you either right or wrong. So the 8, if you get 8 right, you split the pot with, and there's some tiebreaker or something like that. Now, based on those choices, obviously, there's ownership, there's a leverage component. We get a DFS style component to that, but we're offering you to bet on a parlay for $10 to win $1 million, which probably won't be $1 million because it'll be split 47 ways. And the sites just take 15% and don't have you. How would we're going to give away $1 million and we make money on the contest rather than having to pay out $1 million on some market that they fucked up. And, a lot of people bet on one side and the line moved. They don't have to deal with any of that shit. To me, it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously have no insight into how sportsbooks think about this. My perspective is that they don't, as it stands, they don't necessarily view their same game parlays as a huge risk, right? I mean, anybody who shows a pulse will generally be out quickly after taking them, and what's left is, you're right, it's not high dollar bettors for the most part, but it's really no different than say DFS. I mean, they might have, whatever, a couple thousand put in same game parlays if one person wins, that's like paying out a DFS contest. No different than what you're describing. And the other thing I would say is I think you can design the game in probably an interesting way, but at least the way one of the things that makes DFS interesting is like the whole projection part of the game, and that in sports betting is mostly removed. So all you're left with, it's sort of your example of perfect pricing. Now, like you said, the lines could move, but everybody's going to be aware of that. And I would think that very, very quickly, the game is sort of solved that people are playing everything at optimal rates. If the line was 7 and now it's 8, and that means team covers 55% of the time, they're going to be owned 55% of the time. So it would be really hard to, and even if you designed it on money lines or whatever, everybody would have a very, very good estimate of probabilities, just like, immediately, just using markets. So it becomes complicated how you make that game exploitable, because if everything is quote unquote, all the picks are owned at the optimal rate.
But they won't be. But they won't be.
I mean, I just have a hard time if like
you're describing DFS. You're basically saying like, well, if all the players were priced efficiently, right,
Mm-hmm.
then no lineup would have better than the others. But it's like, dude, we have I could play head to heads in NBA where there's a 3K where the entire Milwaukee Bucks lineup is out, and there's literally only one person on the court that is going to play 48 minutes and be 3K, and then go and play 50 head-to-heads and have 5 head-to-heads where the guy that my opponent didn't even play that guy. Like
right, but in a contest of 50, like, is that 5 even enough to pay for the rake? And that's what I think is important. Is, I mean, there's always, I certainly agree with you, there's always going to be people who are just donking it off in any sort of speculation.
but
The
maybe
question
donking. No, but hold on. I think I'm more on your side. Okay, I've come a little bit more. If it was a full NFL, like if we did the basic simple NFL pick the winners, money line or spread, or like, and you had to pick all of them. But I think if we get down to let's say you have $1,000, and this is a little bit more complicated. You have $1,000 bankroll that you need to make 6 bets on, and you could only bet spreads, totals, money lines on any of the 14 football games, right? And it's like some limited menu. Like, there's the fact that there is, yes, people like you and me, we could figure out what the optimal, right? It's just like DFS, but we're not giving we're giving other people where, like, their lineups can't be all that bad, right? But if you just don't, like, if it was a 14 game pick'em, like, it's more likely that the more people that enter this contest, if we had 1 million people that enter the contest, if even on that line move, if the Chiefs should be 68% owned, maybe they come in at 66. Maybe they come in at 70. Maybe there's a slight offness and it doesn't cover the rake on all of these things because we're forcing people to pick 14. But what happens if we just say pick 6? And how much is the Chiefs winning percentage worth on that ownership by having, and then it becomes some more of like an MMA contest where, imagine MMA DFS on a 12 game slate where you have to play a 12 person lineup. Like, obviously, like, we'd all lose to the rake because, like, you're forcing even the worst player to pick at least half the field, right? And then the first thing you're going to do is go, well, I'm not going to pick any of the fighters opposite one another, right? Because only one could win. And now all of those lineups are going to be duped like there's no tomorrow. And then you're going to go, now the field's going to go, well, I'm going to stack the third fight because it's going to be less, like, eventually it's going to reach equilibrium, but only because we're forcing the whole thing. So it's so much easier for people to see, like, what not to do. But when you limit the amount, if you give them more of a menu, a larger player pool, like MLB, you can pick from 300 players, but you can only pick 10 of them, right? You don't have to pick like 600, 200 of them. I think that if they size that correctly, where the menu is large enough and the roster is small enough, but not too small, the roster, your card, that I think there's enough variance that that obfuscates optimal strategies that guys like me and you, 10% of the field, will be able to make good money off of it. 20, 30% of the field break even, and the rest are slightly losing players, and then 20% of the field are horrible players. And there's enough variance involved where the below average players don't understand how to become better than below average. And the players that are kind of break even and slightly better are the people that like intuitively get the concepts but don't run simulations to be the really people that win these more. It becomes like, to me, I think it becomes more like DFS. As far as
Yeah,
an ecosystem, like how the contest
right.
works.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think there's different ways you could do it. I mean, obviously there has been a sports betting sort of championship, and I thought the format of that was actually interesting, where you're not even you're basically just given a bankroll, and it's whoever can run it up the most over a time period. And I think there you obviously have more of an ability to express skill, or at least it's not even so much about betting there. It's more about like the game theory about what other people are going to do and when people are going to go bust, and making sure you put yourself in a position where you can double up or whatever at the end. So I think there are different ways of doing it. I don't know. DFS has seen about zero innovation over the past 5 years. So I guess I wouldn't be holding my breath for these same companies to now go all out on redefining how sports betting can be done. But I hope I'm wrong. It sounds fun, and I hope I'm wrong about DFS too, because obviously I think DFS is a really interesting game. I just worry that as I didn't play poker, I wasn't around for any of that, but my understanding now is that that game is mostly solved on computers. And the thing about but can still be
Well,
played.
you haven't played live poker then.
Well, what I was going to say, yeah. So my understanding is it's mostly solved with computers, and even the best player would lose to a computer now. But live you could still play. The problem with DFS is it would be like there's no such thing as live. So like if DFS becomes gets to that point, or it doesn't even have to get to that point. If it gets to that point within 10-15%, so that we're in the rake margin, there's just going to be no real money. And so
Okay?
because there's no live
Here's a
aspect.
question for you. Okay, I'm setting you up here. Here's a question
Okay.
for you. Do you think we're at that point?
No, I don't think we're at that point.
Okay. That's all I wanted to know. What you exactly said. People said 5 years ago. Like people said in 2017. It's like, dude, less bad players. There's less bad line. That more efficient sound. Like all the points that you were making 5 years ago. People said, yeah, I don't know if this is going to last 5 more years. And now it's 5 years later, and I'm going, are we at that point? And you're not on camera, but I could see you. Your face was like, no, of course, like almost like shrugged, like no, we're not near. And that. So how long?
Do you
How long?
think
Do you think we got at least another 5 years? I think we got at least another 5 years, if not
well
10, maybe 15 years.
well here's a question. Do you think the number of people playing like profitably, like pros, has decreased substantially, like from 5 years ago?
Uh, yes, but I think there's an external factor of that.
Money to be
Their
made
money
elsewhere.
was better used in other facets.
Well, isn't that part of the problem? If 5 years from now people's money is better used in other facets again, I mean,
That that just means that it's an ecosystem. If the best players leave, even though they're profitable, to go off and do something else, put money into fucking JPEGs or whatever the fuck they're gonna do, right? Gotta buy Crazy Apes or Jungle Cats or whatever stupid shit that they're buying. Doesn't that just mean that someone like me just moves up and go, okay, I'll take my 7%. Like if I don't mind that.
Well, I mean, at least the way I think about it is I view the best players when a good player or pro stops playing. I generally take that as a sign that they don't think there's money in it for them really anymore. The amount of money is worth it, and so that could be that they have lost their edge. But I sort of more view that more likely as they just the rake is too high for them to realize that edge, and they no longer think it's a worthwhile thing. And if they are at that point and we're losing more like pros, I think everybody else is probably like to me that doesn't mean like, oh, all their profit they're passing off their profits. What that means is they are now like break even or losing to the rake, and they're passing that off to everybody.
No, but I don't think.
And
But no, but I don't think that's the case. I think the time investment involved, because I've spoken to several pros, if you want to call them pros, that don't play as often as they normally do, that they did 2 or 3 years ago, and all of them it's like, and most of them do their own stuff, do their own projection. There's like for the time investment, like they are as profitable. Yeah, their profit has gone down. Yeah, games have gotten better. Yeah, they don't not admit that, but it's like it's profitable to play, and I would make a good amount of money playing it. But for the amount of instead of 8 to 10 hours a day, I just took all of my money and put it into these NFT projects, and in a month I tripled my money because it went up, and then I dumped and what like, so it's like why am I spending 8 to 10 hours a day? Like yeah, I could. They'd be like, oh, dude, with the crypto market that the way that it went down the past month or so, but I see a lot of people that used to play DFS like and didn't play for the past 2 or 3 years that much. I see them in contests now. So like to me that I'm anecdotally refuting your point that people are leaving because of the rake or lack of edge. It's more of a like it's more the fact of like, do I want to spend 8 hours a day grinding this? The same thing for online poker. Like, dude, I could be profitable playing poker, especially live. I could go across the river here in Caesars, whatever, Horseshoe in Indiana. It's a half an hour drive. I could. Those games are easily beatable, even with the 2-5 game, even with the rake. The 1-2-300 game, even with the rake, I could beat that for 15-20 bucks an hour, no problem. Is 15 to 20 bucks an hour like in this day and age? Is it that like, dude? Would I rather do that, or I'd rather wake up and play DFS and make more than that, right? Or if it turns out that like, dude, I'd make more just putting all my money into a treasury bond. I mean, like it's not that low, but it's like, isn't the goal, at least for me, is to make the most amount of money for the least amount of work. So I like DFS still involves work, just like live poker. You have to be there and see cards. There's a time investment. DFS has much less of a time investment. You don't physically have to be once the lineups are submitted and it locks. You do whatever the fuck you want. You don't have to do anything else. I don't think I think it's more that than people. They're either leaving because they're not profitable anymore. That is one, and some that could be the case, or they could be profitable, but they just went broke, right? It's one of those things where playing way above their means, no bankroll management. The swings went like this, it went to zero, and they can't play any further. But I think a lot of it is, if you told me I could get a 7%, 5 to 7% daily return on an asset, where it's just like I could just give my money to just someone else, and then they just send me checks. But the concession is I can't play any DFS anymore. Wouldn't I be stupid not to just do that? So I think that's more of it than the games that DFS is dead, because they'll say that every year every year DFS is dead. I heard it 5 years ago, then
well,
4 years ago. It's every fucking year.
To actually answer your question, I won't give a time frame, but one of the sort of, I think we touched on it briefly. One of the things that I think will really probably negatively hurt the game would be moving towards some of this contest sim. I think the game becomes really hard, and I'm guessing your counterpoint is that people aren't going to use it, but my counterpoint is that it doesn't really matter the number of people who use any of these things. Like guy who just plays 3 lineups a week, it doesn't really matter how good or bad that person is. It really matters to people because such a small group of people are putting in so much of the money, that if like the general DFS ecosystem, the people who are on Twitter every day are adopting these tools where they can sort of full contest sim this out and play lineups based on that, it's going to be really hard to achieve an edge. So I mean, maybe I was more I had all these companies. I mean, all the DFS companies. The buzzword is like simulation, and all these companies are trying to do like different sim products now. And so I had thought this was a direction that they would go in quicker. Most are still just sort of at the simulation of contest level and not really doing anything. Or sorry, simulation of the sporting results level and not really the contest. But to answer your question, we can check back in when someone has a product like that out on the marketplace and see.
Right. Well, haven't I called that the Holy Grail. I said, I've I've talked to people. I mean, I had Justin
Right.
Freeman. He's doing Run the Sims. It's like, oh, we're simulating all the all the NFL games. I go, come back to me when you're simulating the Millie Maker, when you're simulating the play
Yeah.
action, when you like that's what you should be building. Like you build that, and here I'll start signing up right now, and that's I agree with that point. If that becomes the mainstream thing where so many more 150 maxers, like if you I judge a lot of the contests more by the percentage of 150 maxers for large field, or the percentage of even if you want to highlight, if you go to the grab some contest files and say these are the users that you believe are the sharpest, and just how many lineups contain those users. So like even if in a single entry $100 contest for 500 entries, you're like, well, I'm just going to get all this data and all these users that I believe are profitable and go like, well, 34% of the field are those users versus 48% of the field in this contest. Like, to me, I think I I would agree. Is that more on your side of like, yeah, the ones and twosies, they're going to come and go, but like it turned out in the NFL season, like what happened in the NFL on DraftKings is that they significantly pared down that $9 slant contest. It used to be 65,000 entries with a 150 max, and they kind of slowly brought that down. They raised the first place payout to make it steeper, and then a lot of times, many weeks, it would be 25,000 entries. But the number of 150 maxers never changed. So it went from a contest that was like 26%, 24%, 150 maxers to a contest that was like 48 to 52%. And at that point, I'm like, I'd much rather have a larger contest with more variance than have half the field be basically lineups that I don't believe I have much of an advantage over, if any. That like that's the concept you're talking about, more so than like, well, if this profitable player quits, that just means that everyone's dead.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, because there's still, going back to the beginning of the conversation we had, even 150 maxers, I think there still is a lot of they're still submitting like they might be profitable on whole, but they're still submitting a lot of quote unquote negative EV lineups because they, without true sort of like simulation based stuff.
And you're talking about
it's
MMA.
hard.
You're talking about MMA primarily.
I've only looked at this for MMA. I'm
Okay.
guessing that is probably true in all sports, though. I think it's probably very unlikely that. I think it's probably pretty rare that someone can submit a 150 positive EV lineups.
Tell me the details of the MMA. So, what I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying for you to explain it to the general audience on
Mhm.
how could someone be profitable with 150 lineups, even though you're saying that like the common discourse is that they're good players enter 150 plus EV lineups, and what you're saying is based on what you're seeing is that the people that enter 150 lineups are not profitable because they're entering 150 plus EV lineups. They're entering like a select 10 or 20 really profitable lineups amongst a bunch of break even lineups and then a bunch of really negative EV lineups. That it's their propensity to find the really good ones to do so. And my follow up question to the question that you have not answered yet is 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 there a way to find out what those 10 or 20 are and just play those?
Yeah, if that was the case, then I would
You
not
wouldn't
be one of
tell
the
me. You
ones who
wouldn't
would.
tell me if that was
Well,
the
no,
case.
no, well, I wouldn't tell you, but I also wouldn't be. I would have called out myself as the only one who cannot submit negative EV lineups. But even this really proves my point of, obviously my EV calculations are heavily biased towards me because that's what my simulations are based on. And so hopefully I can simulate, and generate the highest EV in your own simulations. That is, if you're not doing that, there's probably something wrong. But that that obviously doesn't mean that's a case because your sims are going to be biased towards you. But even my lineups, I'm submitting roughly a third usually are negative EV sort of post hoc. I think the general I've seen that the top 10 people who are usually EV, and that obviously changes contest to contest. They're usually around somewhere between 60 and 70 positive EV lineups. This is for MMA out of 150, according to my sims. But they're, they could be several $100s in EV. So what that means is, yeah, exactly what you said. They're submitting probably 70 or so lineups, 80 lineups that are marginally negative EV. And that's because of the rake and all that, and just the lineups they select. But then they have, maybe half or so that are positive EV, and of those half, some are like very, very positive. So, if the entry is $15, you might have a handful that are 40, 50, 60. I think the highest EV I had in this most recent contest was a lineup that was worth like $95 in profit. So, that's like 6x. The entry fee. So that's obviously a very good one. Now the problem is how your question, how you identify those. So, obviously it's very dependent on the win probability of the lineup and how unique it is. But even beyond that, it's, and this is why, like why it's hard to optimize just based on a contest sim is because you can submit unique lineups and they can be unique, but actually a lineup that's duped 4 times might be better if there's not other lineups that sort of look like that. Because you could have a unique lineup, but share 5 fighters with 1,000 other lineups, or you could have a lineup that's duped 4 times in an extreme, maybe only share 5 fighters with like 10 other lineups.
Right.
And so that matters a lot, and why it's more complicated than just looking at uniques, and why it's not that's where like
But it's
a
also but it's also
contest.
win probability. I mean, I could build a unique lineup by playing the 6 biggest underdogs. Most
Oh,
likely,
right, yeah,
people are not going to
absolutely.
leave 8,000 on the table and play a 42K lineup. But the likelihood of them being the 6 highest scorers on the slate, I mean, are just so low. But
Hmm.
people go, okay, that makes sense. And then I go, like I pondered on average. I mean, I questioned this on the past episode or something, or on one of the shows, that on average, I'm not saying on specific slates, but on average, because I think you showed on Twitter some distribution of salary that I conceptually, intuitively, assuming that the pricing is efficient to some extent. Obviously, it's based more on the money line odds than on the actual can they score a lot of points probability. Uh, that the most valuable lineups seem to me should be ones that spend the most salary that are unique. Like if you could find 50K lineups that are unique, 49.9 lineups that are unique, there are way few of them that on average, if you were to take and didn't even count the fighters who on the slate, any type of anything, and just simulated out 52 weeks worth of whatever MMA 100 MMA contests, different ones, not just the same one, that on average, that the lineups that are higher salary, that are more unique, are more profitable.
Yeah, absolutely. The one caveat I'd put is there's a lot of people who seem to do that, but stack fights. So I would not
Right.
recommend that for the most part. But yeah, I think like as a general rule of thumb, if you're not going to build your own projections or simulate out any of these like win probabilities, the general advice I would give to anybody would be try and build lineups that are 49.5 around or higher, maybe even down to 49.2. See, this all depends very much on a slate,
Right.
somewhere in there, and then aim to have it be duplicated less than about 5 times.
Right.
And I
Which,
think it's at
but
worst
you're
probably
highlighting exactly what I aim for.
exactly. You're right. So I mean, there's the thing about that is again, there's certainly ones in there that are much better. But the crude sort of way of doing that would be, I think you can't go super wrong. There's certainly some negative ones in there as well. And that goes to the point I was making just about, again, it's not just this lineup itself is unique. It's important how it would fit into other lineups that look close to it, because you're gonna. I mean, it's no different than other sports. But I think in some of the sports where you're so focused on unique, this point gets a little bit ignored. Is that lineup that's duped a couple times but doesn't have lineups that are similar to it is probably better than a lineup that is unique and has tons of things that are very similar with just maybe like one-offs, because then you're competing against a lot more and fading a lot more things. So and
We see that
that's what.
in NFL Showdown a lot. A lot of slates in NFL Showdown. The winning lineup will be a solo lineup that you look at and go, that doesn't look that crazy. And it'll be like a 48-7 lineup, and it's like, and there's like an 8% owned guy in it, so it's not like a 1% owned anything. You look at it and you go, yeah, probably most people didn't play these two, like, and you just look and you go, yeah, individually this doesn't look crazy, but from a standpoint of once you import all the rest, when you download all their lineups and you run a correlation of players to each other, it's just that like these combination of like these four players are just so like just so happen that those four, probably due to people jamming in correlation, it's like a lot of people, if they play the wide receiver and the captain, they play the quarterback also. So like a lot of lineups are going to share that. So maybe you're playing a what like these combinations that don't exist as much, and those are the six highest scoring players on the slate. Like you win solo, even though your ownership product, right, actually doesn't look great because just the combination of players, rather than what a lot of people do is go, I'm going to play this lineup that makes sense and take out one guy and put in like the sixth wide receiver that's going to be 0.9% owned. And it's like, that may be a unique lineup also. Maybe it's duped twice. Maybe it is. But that's highly reliant on like you're competing against 2,800 other lineups practically, and it's all going to be dependent on if that one guy does well compared to those, on whether or not you get first or you get 2,800th, while that other lineup with like a 4v4 off of so many other combinations, like that 1% owned guy doesn't even, like, if he puts up 7 points, may not even fucking matter, like against all those other lineups, because we get back to the very beginning of the correlation between the line that you're losing. The more your lineups look like other lineups, the more equity you lose in a progressively paid out contest.
Yeah, and that it really hits on the challenge of predicting duplicates, because you can take product ownership, multiply it by the number of entries in a contest, and get something okay. But the problem is the correlation between ownership. We talked about in the beginning, sort of like the correlation between fighters or whatever and optimal rates. But there's also a ton of correlation between fighters in that, like highest price fighter might be 50%, lowest price fighter might be 10%. So you'll say, oh, those together 5% of lineups, but really like it's probably 10%, because probably everyone who has the lowest price fighter probably has the highest price fighter too. So um, you know, understanding that is important in getting the number of duplicates, and it's so sensitive like to these things, like when you're predicting duplicates, that the decision and the profitability of having a lineup that is um, duped twice versus 5 times makes a huge difference in the EV. And so if you're not accounting for that in some way or trying to, it just makes a really really big difference, which is part of the challenge of these heavily duped sports.
Well, what would you say to Brian Jester, who always comes up? Apparently, does really well in MMA, but in your Sims, he's horrible.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I certainly don't take my Sims as gospel. I've been doing them. I've only been playing for about 2 months or so. Um, but it's interesting looking at the like where people's profitability comes in my Sims. I mean, I feel pretty good about them because the list of most profitable players typically is a list of people that um, it's not surprising. A lot of pros, and I often have a lot of the Osimo guys, or Stochastic, I guess now, at the top of the list. You're generally up there in the top part. So it's not like I'm identifying um, a bunch of randoms as the most profitable people. So that's one way I feel okay about it. It'd be interesting to compare with because really the way, I think the best way you're playing well is if your lineups are looking good in someone else's Sims. But what is interesting is always at the bottom of the list too is a bunch of pros too, and it's generally the people who I would say play uh, really the most focused on uniques. And I think there are some um, things that I'm not capturing. So two things come to mind, and I think these are two things I think that Brian focuses on is um, he uses actual, like, fighter tendencies. So my sim doesn't. He
Right. Well,
doesn't.
I was gonna say I think the biggest flaw, because I've talked to Brian before. I've talked to other people as well. I think in general, MMA sims across the industry by most people is done incorrectly. I think I
So,
think I
all
think
right.
they're fun. I think they're fundamentally they're not. It's not like they're done incorrectly based on the data that you have. I think they're fundamentally flawed based on the data that you have.
I'm interested to hear how they're fundamentally wrong, just because I'm not taking into account, like a grappler versus a boxer.
No,
Or
I think there's not enough data for the context.
well, so
I
I
don't think I
think
don't think there's I don't think there's any way. I think that's there's fundamentally no way to regress the any.
I
I'm talking about
yeah.
like take the fighter that has the most amount of fights, and I'll tell you that he's still about 14 lifetimes before having any useful data. Like I just think that the data you on a 3 round fights with they fight twice. I just think that fights that are 5 years apart from each other. To me, I view it more MMA fight data as like BVP in baseball. Of like, well, this guy hit 2 home runs and 7 at bats off of this pitcher over the course of 10 years. Is he gonna hit a home run to dude? It could be
Right.
0 for 7. He could be 2 for. I just think that using almost any of that has such a high error rate that if you're gonna build like Sims based on that, that I can't. How could they possibly be accurate?
Well, so to clarify, I totally I agree with your sentiment, and this is why I don't use any like individual fighter statistics. So like I when I first started building this, I thought let's say I'm trying to model how many strikes a person's going to have in a round. The first thing you generally think to do that is look at how many strikes this person has per round, how many strikes the other person has, or something, and use some sort of historical data. But the problem you're describing is exactly right. Like, it's such small sample sizes for any individual fighter, and over such a long time frame. And there's, I'm not an expert on MMA, but it could seem to really be dependent on fighter strategy and stuff. So I didn't want to use anything. I knew whatever I would model with the fighter specific stats would just be noise. And so what I do is I just use just use the gender and the weight class to model these things. So it's very so it is credible at that level. There's very minor differences between different weight classes strike at different rates and different genders strike at different rates, and that's true of takedowns, knockdowns, all that sort of stuff. So that's how at least I've gotten around the sample size issue. Now, one of the obvious problems with that is I'm not saying that there's no way of predicting like this person's going to be more likely to take someone down than this person. I think you certainly could do that, and I think that's my understanding is that's a big part of like Brian's strategy. And so, from my perspective, that would seem really hard to be predictive in any sort of way. But if you grind tape or whatever, I'm sure there is a value add there. But to answer your question, I don't think that fundamentally like is incorrect then, because I'm just using very large samples of saying like on average heavyweights strike this much, and then I'm randomly using a regression to do that, and then randomly sampling from how I think those are distributed. So
Right, and I think that from a like if everyone was equal, that would be the correct way to do it. But everyone isn't equal, so like to me, what I've found, because I've looked into this a lot more, and of course I don't have the background that you have, so what I do is way more rudimentary and not necessarily the most precise. Is that I've found that the betting markets are more. It's what I'm trying to do, and what I've tried to analyze, and I did this a year ago, right? And I do it every like 3 months or so because it takes me God knows how long to do everything. Because I do everything manually. Because I have to cut and paste. I don't have fucking fancy processes. Is that essentially I don't care about any outcomes that don't involve at the beginning point. I didn't care about any outcomes that did not involve finishes. So, because in MMA DFS, we're not looking. I don't care about medians. I don't care about any of that. So it's like, what happens if I don't even bother trying to simulate or even predict average outcomes? All I want to do is predict 100 plus. I want to predict finishes, because I don't know how they're going to finish. Is it going to be a KO? I have no fucking clue. But for instance, like using the extreme example, like I always start from the extremes. Round one finish. What's the R squared to 90 points? It's obviously 1, right? Because you get 90 points in DK for a first. So it's like, okay, so like how efficient are the first round odds, closing lines on all the fighters? And it's like, well, however close they are to that, like they got to score 90 points. I mean, like they have to score 90%. How often do fighters, no matter what their style, no matter whatever, whether or not they're an underdog, I mean, even though they're probably not, what's that correlation to 90 points based on and how efficient are the lines? And I found absurdly efficient in the grand scheme of things. So it's like, okay, I got a starting point. Now to 100-point scores. So now I'm taking all the DraftKings data. I'm taking all the I just want to see what are the closing lines, what are the first round. That's it, nothing else. And first round finishes to 100 points, extremely correlative, right? Because most likely, I mean, some people get early finishes and they get no take. They pull guard and it's a 92 points, or they don't get credited for the knockdown. They only get 98. But a lot of times, especially on knockouts, right, you're gonna get knocked down, you get 100 plus points. So it's like, if I could start from there and then go, well, I don't care about an 80-point. Like I'm not trying to predict what an 80-point score. I don't care because it doesn't matter to me in DFS. So I'm not trying to simulate any type of outcome like that. So then once you do the closing lines to all of that, and that's so much more correlative than any fight data I've ever pulled to try to predict the number of like it's just that the range of outcomes is just so wide for that. On do I expect them to how many strikes? What's the takedown defense? All of that type of stuff. Predicting. I tried to think of, well, how many takedowns will someone attempt? Well, let's try to figure out at the like what you did at the weight class at what's the average. Then you start going to comparable fighters. So then you go like because it's very similar to remarketing on for 'cause I did digital marketing. So a lot of this type of stuff I'm used to like I need to market to a bigger audience, but I want to take this subset of an audience and go I want what do they share so now I can advertise to 50,000 more people that share those same things. So I went to the similar fighters, but that wasn't like nothing was more anywhere close to the inside the distance and the round one finishing lines. So it's like the more and more I'm looking at all this data, the more and more it comes back to that point of like why am I even bothering with any of this when I do not have to project if a $7,600 fighter scores 53 points. Like it's an irrelevant score to me. Maybe yes, sometimes that will be in the optimal lineup because of weird shit happens on a slate. I'm perfectly fine with that error rate of just like getting rid of those results and not having them in my sphere of like what could be optimal. And then just going through all of that, the only thing I had to adjust for was a projection because how they finish matters also. So like for 100-point scores, yes, there is my blind spot after doing that was well in a 3-round decision, and the 5-round fighters were the ones that scored horribly because like a 5-round decision, Max Holloway 147 points, but didn't get a finish. So like it would show that he's horrible. And it's like okay, how do I adjust for that? And then you just to me you could do a round score, like an average for weight class, like just like you did, an average per round, and then classify fighters, and I'm essentially just giving them a static modifier. So I'm treating like a grappler at 185 is going to get X amount of points per round on average, compared to X whatever but then everything else is based on betting lines. So like doing that I got much more accuracy. And then Brian on Occupy Fantasy has kind of a metric that is doing something I believe is more advanced but similar to what I'm doing to some extent. Kind of removing like I care only about like the top 10 and bottom 10 percentile outcomes and then just simulating like kind of that. And then what are the relative differences between fighters? And then like but in doing through all of that, like, I know that other people are trying to simulate the actual fucking fights. And I'm like, based on just looking at the DraftKings scores, I know it's, 5 years, 5.5 years, 6 years worth of data. So that's still kind of small sample enough. But in looking at that, I'm like, I don't see how you could possibly model the fight data to be better than just the closing lines and some type of round modifier.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I'm certainly using the lines to model the outcome of the fight. That's like the basis of the of who wins and when they win is using the lines for that, because I certainly, if I could model that better than the lines, I wouldn't be playing DFS. I would be betting
Right.
betting on all that. So I certainly use that for that aspect. Really, the only thing I use the fight data for is the underlying sort of statistics like strikes and takedowns and all that. And I generally agree with your premise. I think you could actually do. I had a tweet thread a while back about exactly how the MMA sim worked, and one of the things I said is, most people, it's not worth it. Honestly, in hindsight, it doesn't add a ton of value. The modeling for some of those statistics, I mean, it's really random, as you've probably seen. There's a ton of randomness there in how much they're going to get per round, and so I probably gain maybe a little bit of value just by modeling it by weight class and doing that. But in reality, you could probably just, I don't remember the exact range, but you could basically do what you were doing, is just select a random sort of average. And then if you want to add randomness to that, like in a sim sort of way, like, what that could vary by. I mean, I think the one thing I would say is there's nothing, and I know you know this, there's nothing magical about 100 points, right? So
Right.
like there's plenty of ways you can win the slate not getting 100 points from it, a fighter, and there's plenty
Right.
of ways you could even lose having all 100. So depending on the size of the slate. So um, that's the one thing that, again, you're always gonna. It's unsurprising, but you're always gonna be missing something when you go a more sort of rudimentary way. But honestly, I think you could do probably 90% of what I do just using the fight data and building out a bunch of rows in Excel and having a bunch of outcomes and then seeing how often people are like at least optimal rates or whatever, pretty easily just using betting odds.
Right. And I mean, that's pretty much what I do. Well, I'm adding something else I've been looking into to make that a little bit better. Because I just try to think intuitively. I try to think conceptually, and it's like I don't know how to necessarily achieve it, and I will spend 8 hours trying to do so, and then fuck up some fucking syntax and I get div zero as my friend. Uh,
I
uh,
know you were talking why do all this work to sim out MMA. It sounds like your process took 10x the time it
well,
took for me to.
only because I'm horrible at Excel. That's the reason. It's not anything else other than that I'm not. I just like. How do I do this? Let me Google it. Oh, okay, that seems good. Why doesn't it work though? Oh, because I need to add this. I need to, and I'll do things. I'll have things on. I have 7 sheets. Why do I need this on all these sheets? And then I have something. Then I cut and paste, and who knows? And I save it wrong, and then it's like, oh, I don't have the original version, and now I have to go. Oh, I'm horrible at Excel. Uh, no, I contextually, like with the averages, I think, and I talked to someone about this a couple of days ago, uh, adjusting for betting lines when it comes to the fight data. Because I'm not, because I looked to it. I did this a couple of weeks ago. It makes it because intuitively it made no sense to me. Why am I weighing? I didn't know. It came down. It was fucking Romanov. It was that Romanov fight where it was minus 2,500. Of course, the fight got scrapped after lock, and everyone went nuts. And I said, why am I giving him this? Like, if it was it was Romanov versus Chase Sherman, right? He was up against Chase Sherman. Let's say it was, instead of Romanov, it was Alan Bordeaux, and it was a pick'em fight. Like, why would I be giving him the same amount of points per round as someone who is that dramatically, like the extreme of, like, if you're a minus 2,500 favorite and a minus 275 to finish inside the first round, like, dude, this guy's gonna fucking kill the other guy. Like, why am I only giving him X points per, why shouldn't I be giving him twice as many points? Like, if he kills him and he doesn't get a finish, this guy could score 140 points. Like, legitimately, you're thinking, what is Romanov going to do? Take him down and ground about him until he submits, until the referee stops the fight. And this could happen 3 rounds in a row, and he could score 150 points in 3 rounds. Why am I assigning him the same amount of points as the average for that? So why shouldn't I be adjusting for, like, the bigger a favorite, the more points per round for that average or whatever, and the lower, like, why aren't I adjusting even that for just the betting? If we both believe that the betting lines are efficient enough to use in our models, shouldn't we also be using that to as a descriptive factor for the fight simulation outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're probably the thing about that is you really only know how much you should be adjusting if you regress or something of every 1% in win expectation is worth how many more in strikes or control time or what have you. So yeah, certainly that is something that I think would add predictive power, beyond just like weight classes. There's something I play a lot of League of Legends DFS. Actually, I made the wrong decision in the pandemic. I decided to build like this full League of Legends model, and clearly there's more money in MMA, so made the wrong decision there. But there's a similar phenomenon that you take into account there, is that when teams are very favored over another team, the amount of kills doesn't follow like the same. The higher favored, obviously, the less kills the loser is going to get, and that might sound intuitive, but the kills are very random in League of Legends, and so it's predictive beyond just like the winner is going to have X kills and loser has Y kills. It's the odds itself is predictive beyond that.
Okay, I was suggesting something to improve your. I want to get it to the point where here's the whole goal, Dean, Dean. I want to get your model good enough to show that Brian Jester's profitable.
Oh man, that's gonna be. He's gonna have to win for like a year straight, and I'll still have him as negative. I thought he won the other day, and
No, he was holding on for first until Gamrot put up 108 points.
I
But
was
it was
thinking
a
I was gonna
three-way
have.
tie. It was embarrassing for him. It was a three-way tie. So he really should have been embarrassed by that.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know if I could come on this podcast if he won again, and I'm still showing him as negative. So I don't know. I hope I can. I mean, I think that the two things that he's probably well, I know that without me incorporating like the actual strategies, like if is this because I think I'm still pretty new to it, but my understanding is like the grapplers generally score much more
They have higher
than
ceilings, yeah.
right. So without incorporating any of that, my stuff is going to be biased towards um, strikers probably, and say that grapplers or whatever are less optimal than they really are. Um, so I don't really know. The other
But
thing,
that's a big thing, dude. That's a big because that's what happened to me when I it's like why like Marab is plus 375 inside the distance. He's 9300. He's the worst projected fighter on the slate. Like that's obviously wrong. He's gonna get 16 takedowns. Like so you can't just go because the betting line will show that yeah you're right. He's most likely not going to finish the fight, but he's going to just dismember the other person and be on top of them and take him down 16 times. So, like for DraftKings purposes, you almost don't want him to finish early. You're hoping that what past the first minute mark that he doesn't finish early because you don't just want one takedown and a submission from him. You want him to just ragdoll him a bunch of times. So once I saw that, I'm like, dude, I'm getting too much like Al Razak Hassan and all these KO artists because yeah, but their ceilings are like first round or bust. Unless they get a knockout early, they're dead. But these grapplers, they could score 120 in a decision. Like you have to adjust for that, and I think that's I think that's very big. And I think if even if you just incorporated that more, like I think that will be more accurate.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I'm aware of. So there's like two parts of any sort of model. You should intervene if you are aware of its shortcomings, right? So like I'm aware of this, and so when I play myself, I try and account for this in different ways. It's just the challenge is I don't necessarily have a great way to model this without that's not manual. Like I said, the ideal way would be is if I could cluster fighters together to categorize them. Maybe it could be even as simple as wrestler or non-wrestler, because that would probably add a lot of predictive power. But the other component is like it's not even as simple, I don't think, as like, oh, there's a wrestler, he's going to have a lot of takedowns. It probably is more complex analysis of like the opponent and who's favored and who's going to sort of dictate the pace of the fight and all that. And the reality is, I think there is probably like a sizable edge if you're willing to do that stuff, like watch fights and learn the fighters. At this point in my life, I don't, even if you max center, each week, that's a couple $1,000. There's just, to me, that's not necessarily worth my time to be like grinding, tape on fighters and stuff. But if this is what you do and, you play a lot of MMA and you're into it, I'm certain that, I mean, I brought it up that that's clearly a huge hole in any sort of profit calculation. Now, is it enough to go from, bottom of the list to top? I don't probably think so, but I don't actually know that. It goes back to what I've said this whole time. Unless you actually sort of quantify it, you don't actually really know. You're just guessing. So maybe it is, maybe it's not, but whatever I'm doing, I feel at least pretty comfortable with it, that it's not a huge red flag or hole, just because, again, the names at the top of the list, I feel pretty good about who's generally there. So
I know I'm not at the top.
you're you're not at the very top, but you're usually, because this is another component of it. I was gonna say is you're usually maybe one scroll down. I think you've been profitable, at least on everyone I looked. The other component about it, which should be mentioned, is when I look at that, I'm just looking at like expected return. But what that doesn't take into account at all is variance. So there are ways you can play to maximize expected return, I think, and this is true of probably every sport. But your variance is going to be very high. For example, on this past slate, well, you could like jam basically one fighter, who's going to be in a ton of low owned optimals, around 50K or whatever. But then if they lose, like you're
You're
out
dead.
your
Right.
entire.
Right.
Right, exactly. So there's different ways you can play, to obviously it's a very variant game, DFS, and so um, at the end of the day, what matters is not ROI. It matters like how much money you make. And so if you're able to get more money down because you're playing less of, less variant, and you're reducing your risk of ruin or whatever, if you have a set bankroll, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I don't think, making 1% on $1,000,000 is better than making 10% on $1,000 or whatever. So, there is something to be said about reducing variance. And I think I haven't, in depth studied your lineups, but I do know you play a little bit more. I think you play a little bit more balanced, such that you're not just like jamming in, a bunch of lineups with one person, even if those are like, at least to my sims, like the highest EV. It seems
Right.
like you're playing a bit more of a balanced approach. And I think
Well,
even in some of the,
I'm less balanced than at times, but I mean I'm typically not playing anyone in like more than half my lineups or something. I mean like sometimes I go overboard. Sometimes I go over like okay, there's a 9K guy that's going to be 10% owned, and maybe I'll have them in 35% of my lineups, but I'm not 85%. I mean like I'm not like that. Sometimes I will be way over or way under. Like this past slate, I think I only had like 12% Arman Sarukian when he's like 47% owned. So I'm like, if this dude smashes, I'm going to be in trouble. I'll have some lineups, but I didn't mind taking that stance on that specific slate. But like, I'm never locking people. I don't lock people in or X people out. I mean, I even had Nate Maness in 2 lineups out of 100. So it's like yes, I'm a bit more balanced than because I know who you talk. I know players that you're talking about that you'll look at their lineups and be like, yep, they pretty much are playing these three fighters and then every possible combination that like they're playing 98% of this guy, 90% of that guy, and 87% of this guy, and then everything else is kind of like whatever. And it's like, well, if those three guys that they don't mind either, losing 2250 practically or minus 95% or possibly come in solo first, solo second, tied for third. So over the average, their ROI could be X. My ROI could be the same exact X, but I would have my profit graph would look like this, and theirs would be like long periods of down, ups, and like even though it's the same ROI.
well, certainly if it's the same ROI, you would want to, holding ROI constant, you want to play like a less variant strategy. So I think, there's usually there's a good mix in MMA, honestly, of who at least I think are, some of the top players of playing
Who do you think some of
very.
you got to say you have no face and no name. You could say whatever you want. Who do you think are some of the top MMA large field players on DraftKings?
Um, I think I mentioned briefly, and again, it's based on my Sims, which we've talked about aren't perfect, but some of the people who consistently, most of the people who consistently come up at the top are tangentially related to Stochastic or Osimo. I think Osimo himself was pretty high up there. I don't know any of these people, but Sean Zahn is consistently up there. I saw Need Lunch Money, who I think was just recently on a podcast,
Yeah.
is up there. A lot of time, what's interesting, one of the things I found is interesting is this the group of people that I think are affiliated with like SaberSim. They usually, what's funny is you usually see like people who are affiliated with different tout sites all clustered together in a certain spot. What's interesting about SaberSim I found is that some of the people are at the top and some of the people are like all the way at the bottom. So I don't know if people are just using those tools differently
Well,
or
wait. I'm
implementing.
assuming you have Reformed Racer up there.
Yeah, he was at least the past slate. He was near the top.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I
So
think Giant Squid does his own stuff.
okay,
He's
yeah,
affiliated with SaberSim, but like, who knows what? I mean, I he uses their stuff and he's part of their, but he does it. He has his own. He has his own
for what
stuff
it's,
on the
yeah.
side. So like
I
that
mean,
that may be
based
different.
yeah, I mean, based on how this is going, you might want to be on the bottom of my list anyway,
Right,
with
right.
near Brian Jester. So take
Or no,
this
no.
for what
Actually, maybe the better part is to either be at the top or the bottom, but the middle is horrible.
that's probably true. I mean, there honestly probably is some truth in that the middle is
I'm
like
in the
people who
middle
are.
though, but I'm in the middle.
But no, you're not in the middle. You're there's a small group that is, well, it's obviously like a small percentage that I would sim as profitable each slate, and I think to consistently being there, if you have any faith in it, I think is probably a good thing. I think the ones that, to me, I question the legitimacy when I see people who 150 max and have been successful DFS players for a long time at the bottom. I mean, I think we know there's a couple things that are probably impacting that, but yeah, I'm guessing a lot of the middle players are people who are just sort of like playing too duped of lineups and slowly bleeding out, because those lineups, they're not like hugely negative EV. Like a dupe lineup, they're just like solidly negative EV. It's not like you're losing your entire entry. Because the other thing I'll say about the bottom of the list that I don't take into account is, and I didn't think I needed to, but now I'm wondering, is like I don't take into account canceled fights, and I think Brian
Yeah,
won
Brian
on
won
one of.
on the slate where the
Exactly,
can't
and
right.
so you might be like, my original thought is like, oh, cancellations are uniformly distributed. You don't need to build anything in for that. But the reality is if you add, like, I don't know what the estimate would be, but even a small estimate of a canceled fight for each fighter, and you're someone who's playing really low owned stuff, when a 40% guy gets canceled and you're playing like really weird lineups, that's really important. The other thing is, I think he won on like a guy getting his eye poked out or
Right, Mike
something.
Jackson, right, yeah.
Yeah. So like that is another thing I don't take into account. So yeah, I mean, what I'll say about that is, like, to the extent you're truly playing for these sort of black swan or wild events,
But
they
that is what Brian does, dude. He won the
that's what I'm
Millie
saying.
in the Super Bowl the same way. Like that his I mean,
Mhm.
that's his outward strategy is that in showdowns and all those types of things is that his aim is to build 150 black swan lineups. I mean, like his
Right.
lineups are, I wouldn't say nuts, but like it's very, if the NFL game has a total of 57, he's building lineups as if it's going to only score like it's going to be like 10-3, right? Like
Yeah, and
what is
I think
optimal in those situations while almost everyone else is building for everything else. And then vice versa. And then in games where it's like defense is 30% owned, he's playing shootout lineups, 5-1s, and some team's going to score 49 points. And he knows that most slates are minus 95% doing that, but if you win enough times, then you're profitable. So like I think that
yeah.
maybe that's one of the main keys of why your blind spot is that like those events.
Yeah, right. I mean, the reality is those probably happen more often than people think, and they don't happen enough that you would most people think to model them. But yeah, those sort of one-off things, they happen, and they can make a. I mean, this whole conversation, we talked about how, very minor changes can cause huge impacts in the calculation of EV. So, if 50% fighter gets um, scratched, like even 2% of the time, he's going to have a lineup like we were talking about that looks like nothing like anybody else's for the most part. It not only is unique, but it doesn't even really look like other people's. And so there's huge equity in that. So yeah, I mean, I think there's probably some of that going on, coupled with the fight data, um, or the fighter specific, like what they want to do in the ring. Um, but overall, I mean, MMA is not that complicated beyond that stuff of a sport to sim. So I feel pretty comfortable with what I have, and feel some reassurance that consistent names who I believe to be winning players are consistently at the top.
Right, because if it was completely off, you would see a bunch of people that play a one lineup, two lineup, like, and all these 150 maxers at the bot. Like, if you saw that, you'd know that, like, no one could survive that. Like, just realistically, like, they can't drop 90% every slate. I mean, like, it has to be right. It's you're Occam's razor. Like, the fact that you're getting so many quote unquote 150 maxer pros, or at least 100 or whatever names that you recognize up there, that the Sims have to be right, and the fact that some aren't. But it could be the opposite. But see, the thing is, Ox's Razor could be the opposite. That because you're doing something similar, that all the other, it's that bias of, like, of course your lineups will come up the highest. So anyone that's playing your type of Sims will come up the highest. And the ones that are at the, if you find that there's 8 150 maxers on the bottom, it could be that it's the opposite and they're the most profitable because they're doing something that's completely different from you, and that's the reason why they are profitable. Or it could be a mix of both, that there's a balance on certain slates and certain types. One will be and one won't be. Like there has to be a reason. There has to be a reason why Brian Jester comes in the bottom of your Sims, and comes in the bottom of a couple of people that I've spoken to Sims. But theoretically, from a conceptual standpoint, I agree with this strategy. I agree. Other than the fact that the only thing I disagree with Brian on is that the context of the slate matters as far as unique. Like, I'm big on that whole, on average, you want to play the highest salaried unique lineups, less duplicated lineups. So I'm more likely to build 49-7 lineups, 49-6 lineups that I think will be duped 2 or 3 times, maybe unique. And he's more likely to go, what's the best way for me to get 150 uniques? Let me build lineups with an average salary of 48-7. And then there are certain slates where I look at and go, this is not the type of slate where that type of lineup has an outsized chance. The types of slates that have outsized chances are when, like, the most expensive fighter's 9,400 and only like a minus 185 favorite. Like, when they, like, even the most expensive, the biggest favorite isn't even that big of a favorite. Like, it's like, okay, so many pick'em fights. Yeah, the optimal lineup could have, like, leave 3,000 on the table. But when you have certain slates where, like, even when you get down to the $8,400 range, you're at minus 285 or something. That's an extreme example. It's like, now this is a slate where, in most likelihood, 1, maybe 2 underdogs win, and then it's just a battle of who has the highest 4 or 5 scoring favorites. And then when I see people building lineups that leave 1,500 on the table for those slates, I go, yeah, I guess that those are the black swan events. And it's like, I'm going to build the lineups that aren't that. Good luck on those. That's not going to happen often enough. I don't think those lineups are profitable, actually.
Yeah, I mean, and I think another component of it with the sim is, most people, and you should be building to come in first in any of these top heavy contests. But the reality is, like, over a long term, over any sort of long sample size, a lot of your equity actually comes from not coming in first. Like a lot of the total money, if you're 150 maxing, like, over a long term, you're going to actually, quote unquote, make more money from, like, get more return from, like, the non-first prizes than the first prizes. And so, if you're just basically punting that off, and I'm not saying that anybody is, but I think that's in sometimes overlooked part of it, is that it's not really like first or bust, right, over the long term, because That is a big, sometimes the way I think about it, and not perfect, but the 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 wins you have pays for all your losses, and then what's left over is like what you've min cashed um,
Mhm.
over the time period. So
But
it's
it's
all
also a
really.
matter of survival. I mean, most and a lot of people don't realize that. You put in 22.50. When I won 50 max to $15 or whatever in MMA, a lot the average outcome is I put in 22.50 and I get back 1,500. I get back 1,400. A bad day I'll get back 600. But it's I'm not losing the whole I'm not losing because I'm not locking in fighters. I'm playing a more diversified set of lineups. And what you're saying is that a lot of the return you're seeing is getting that equity back. And if you had an infinite bankroll, maybe you'd side on the I don't care about losing it all as long as I win first and just prioritize that. But if you don't have an infinite bankroll, like it's the I mean, maybe the risk of ruin is even too high for those strategies. You need to have a very, very big bankroll in order to survive that.
Yeah, I think that's certainly right. And it sort of goes back to the point of the survivorship bias. I think it's really hard and would be pretty unlikely for um, if you don't have some sort of success early, it's really hard for you to lose for say 6 months and keep playing right in these contests for most people. And so I think probably the majority of people start out and might have a little bit of success or, quote unquote, get lucky and hit a tournament. And that affords them the time to really learn and get better. Um, I think there's probably a lot of similar people to the people who are playing professionally today who just didn't win for the first 6 months or whatever and just quit. So and what winning in early allows you to do is most people early on are probably losing players, but winning early allows you to get better and have that bankroll probably to make mistakes, but eventually get to a point where you're a winning player. So it's so dependent. Your success in DFS, because it's so variant, is so dependent on like when you win. It makes a huge difference if you win early versus like sequence of returns. Like say you would have won if you would have kept playing 2 years from now or whatever. Um, it's a wildly variant game because of the nature of how top heavy the payouts are.
It's also the type of thing that I think back on how much more money could I have won had I been more like people you I think more in those terms like you described of like I'm that's how I'm a nit. I'm not a nit in my play style. I'm a nit in my bankroll management, but it comes down to maybe maybe there was way more of an edge back in 2016, 2017 that I shouldn't have been as conservative and if I wasn't and I upped my risk of ruin, if I upped it, maybe I'd be sitting here with, and playing $10,000 head to head. Maybe I'd have a $10 million bankroll had I done that, but I chose not to, and I chose to like I'll be Joey Knish, I'll be whatever, and like or it could have been that I could have done that and then been broke, and then you would no one this podcast wouldn't even exist. You would have never even heard of me.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about this betting or DFS is that you should probably be pretty confident you have an edge first before you do it. But then once you do, I think I disagree with you on your nittiness. I think most people probably underdefine their bankroll. I think because most people have jobs and can re-up that. You are different. I know,
Mm-hmm.
but most people probably um, define their bankroll as probably too small. And if you have an edge, at least I'm of the opinion um, to jam it while you do, because most people their bankroll is replenishable, so you're really not
Well,
over
that's at
betting
the low
per se.
levels. That's at low. But I agree with that at the low. I agree. Like when people say they have $1,000 bankroll, I said if you have enough disposable income to play $1,000 in DFS, you don't have $1,000 bankroll. You have a much bigger bankroll than that. But I disagree with you. The point, and maybe it's just a personality thing, is that I'm never confident in my edge. I think it's not. It's not. It's, to me, it's not like it's not as more clear defined as poker that the edge could be different on different days, could be different sports, could be different everything. Could be, I mean, how do you like people use Kelly and like how could you use Kelly for DFS? How do you define what my edge is on today in a sport? I have no idea. It's the constant state of the sample sizes in DFS are small enough. People don't realize how small they are. That am I good or have I just gotten lucky for 6 years? Now, obviously, as the time goes by, I'm more and more confident. But like, how confident can you ever be at a specific period about this is how much you should be playing? And you mentioned the survivorship bias of a lot of people that are around now are there were 5 times as many. It's just that we're the ones that are left, or at least the ones that are playing high stakes are the ones that are left that won early 5, 8 years ago or something like that. So like, do I have an edge now? Do I not have an I? So that's where my nittiness comes from. Of like, I'd rather I over define my bankroll, and I under define my edge, and I go. I think to me, it's instead of solving a Kelly formula, which is like maximizing for ROI, I'm maximizing for a nut, right? I'm at like what instead of what can how can I play to get $50,000 to $75,000 in a calendar year, and then backing after that it may not be the highest ROI, it may not even be the lowest risk of ruin, but it's something in the middle where it's like your optimal chance of getting that profiting that amount involves you doing X, and I'm trying to come close to that X, while a lot of people are doing the opposite. They're going, how do I maximize for the most amount of money, the most amount of ROI, or the least amount of risk of ruin, and not setting like a. Well, yeah, it's possible I could have last year made $1.2 million if I really had that edge, quote unquote. But I'm not solving for 1.2 million. I'm solving for 50 to 75,000. So, like I know you as an actuary, you disagree with my assessment because I'm way too risk averse.
Yeah, I actually don't disagree with you that much here. I mean, if that is, like your goal to make that amount of money, I respect that, and I honestly I think I understand, like, some people, like, betting a lot of money is not necessarily comforting and can have a impact on people's quality of life. And so, if being out like a certain amount of money is going to make someone uncomfortable, like whether or not they have the bankroll to, like, whether I think they should be uncomfortable with that or not doesn't really matter, right? So to me, I don't necessarily have an issue with it. The only thing I would say is that if your goal is to make 50 to 70,000 a year, you're probably even more likely to do that. Like, I know this is going to sound obvious, but like taking on more risk, you're more likely to hit it, right? Like, because the more you play and the more sort of runs through you get, the closer you're going to get to approximating your true edge. And so when you play, for example, if you're not playing 150 lineups or whatever, you're basically actually increasing your variance. You're not decreasing it. So like the more you play, actually you decrease.
Right, but
the more you play in terms of slates, not money,
right.
but in terms
but
of
that's
slates.
But that's all dependent on your edge. So like,
right.
if you knew you had an X% edge plus whatever, you'd want to play more lineups because that would lower your variance. Mm-hmm. But if you couldn't if that the impact of the number of lineups you play is exponential based on the edge that you have. So let's say, because we always talk about, if I had 150 lineups, I could have win everything. It's like, yeah, if you're a bad player, you're just going to lose faster, right? So that's the point that I'm making of like, if you can't clearly define your edge, if you're more prone to underestimating your edge, shouldn't you be more prone to playing less lineups? Because if you don't have an edge, all you're doing is going broke quicker by playing more lineups.
Yeah, yeah. I
Isn't
mean,
there
and
what I'm saying is that there's no correct answer, but I think there's an equilibrium. So like I try to play that like if I'm not sure I necessarily have an edge in MLB or I can't define it, maybe instead of playing 150, I play 80. Right? So if I do have an edge, at least I'm playing enough lineups that to realize it. But if I'm wrong, at least I'm going broke twice as slowly as playing 150. Yeah, like it's like that middle ground. And if you're not even sure even more, maybe then you should be playing 40 lineups. Like I think there's not a black and white answer to this.
no, I mean, obviously quantifying your edge in DFS is near impossible. You know, it would be easy. One thing you could do is you can sort of use past results to simulate future potential outcomes. I mean, one thing you could do is like a bankroll sim where you take all your returns on various days in sports and just randomly sample that with a starting bankroll and see where you end up. Now,
Yeah, yeah,
obviously,
you go
like
broke. You typically go broke like 30% of the time.
right. Well, you could see what, yeah, you could see what your the bankroll you like what is the worst 25% of outcomes? What's the worst 10% of outcomes? What's even interesting to do is just rearrange your own results and see like if I had started out, stuck 100K, would I be here now? Like if I going to the point of rearranging when you win and stuff. But that could be somewhat helpful. To see like what potential swings you would have, like simulate that out like that. Obviously, the point that is implicitly in there is that your past returns are going to be indicative of your future, and there's no guarantee of that. But I would at least that's how I would think about it. Is I would sort of see what swings am I comfortable with. Like if I have a bottom 10% outcome, how much am I going to lose? Am I okay with that? Um, and basically uh, wager according to that. I don't know exactly what numbers I would use for that necessarily. Like, am I okay? What percent of outcome at what percent of loss am I okay with? That's a personal decision, I think. But um, I think that would at least give you sort of like an insight into like, here's how much I can reasonably expect to lose, and like, would I be okay with that? Um, that's at least how I would think about it.
Right, it's the okay part. I'm not okay with losing. I
You
don't
got to
want. I
lose to
don't mind.
win.
I was used to the poker swings. The DFS swings are to me the DFS swings are way worse than poker.
Well, I didn't play poker, but I don't think there's a game close to the variance of DFS that has ever been played for substantial money. I'm guessing. I mean, it's when you think about like if you thought of a DFS contest as just a bet, um, like the the payout to the wager. So like the odds you would get for the first place prize is so ludicrous. I mean, we talked about this, like that's why people are interested in it, but it's so ludicrous. I mean, you can look at simulations of betting results if you're just betting like 10 to 1 dogs, which is less of a, sort of average payout than DFS, from where your money comes from. And the swings are going to be incredible, if you were just betting like 10 to 1. So in DFS, it's just going to be absolutely absurd. And so, I
Right,
mean,
a lot of these
this is
contests are like 10,000 to one.
exactly. I mean, this is why I don't like. I never really had interest in being someone who MMEs, and I probably can't even. I'm probably not. I couldn't even be profitable at them. But even if I could, um, or I should say MMEs for like NFL, MLB, NBA, these main contests. Even if I could, um, I don't think I have the personality to deal with the swings. Like it would impact my life in a way that wouldn't be worth whatever money I would make. Now, if I was one of the best players in the world, maybe that money would be worth it. But honestly, like it's just not. It's not like a lifestyle decision for me. So I really respect the people who are out there MMEing every day. I think it's I play again more smaller entry type stuff. where the variance is lower, and even losing, obviously you're going to even lose there, several days, week in a row or whatever, and that's hard. I can't even imagine wanting to get up and keep working when you're losing for months on end. So I mean, I think more people would honestly enjoy DFS playing it in not those MMEs, but I know the top prize is super attractive, but it's just a really hard um, pill to swallow in lifestyle, and hard to keep playing well, I would think too. Because I would just guess you're continually tweaking and changing your process, and hard to actually like gauge if what you're doing is good or not. So yeah, I don't envy those people, and that's why I don't play that stuff.
Well, I don't play. I don't play for the same reason. I obviously have a bit more risk. I'm a nit, but I'm still play for more money and more volume and take on more risk than you do. But I'm still cognizant of like one thing I remember you tweeted. It's like I don't ever proclaim myself to be anything but that. Like because people will come to people and say I think you're wrong on this thing or whatever. It's like, well, based on what I'm looking to do, it's like, yes, you're right. That would be a more profitable strategy, but I'm not willing to, right? Or that, or
Right.
people will say, I mean, constantly, you'll hear one of two things. You'll either hear, have you ever won the Millie Maker? I'll go, no. It's like, well, you can't be a good player then. It's like, well, that person obviously does not understand variance whatsoever. And I say, I don't even play the Millie Maker. And they go, why don't you play the Millie Maker? Because someone that doesn't understand variance. Okay, so like, I'm not looking to make $1 million. That's a negative EV contest until you win it. But then you hear the other hand, why aren't you playing the 888, the 77, like whatever, the top high stakes 3 max or 15 max or something. It's like, why don't you play 3 entries into the 8? It's like, those are also the best players in the world. It's like I need somewhere in between. Where do I find the best edge? It's like the large field contests, right? Which obviously the variance is ridiculous. I'm just looking for edges around, and it's like, well, it would be so much. Why don't you just, if you're a good player, shouldn't you be competitive in the 777 or something? I said, my goal isn't to be competitive. My goal is to make $50,000 to $75,000 a year. Like, if you start from there, like, you have some framework on how to play. And I think so many people that either try to play more seriously or as a side income, I'm not talking about even professionally or for an income or reasonable sum of their income, is that there's no, like, I think it's so much easier to figure out how to play well if you set a goal like that is realistic. So when I tell people that, they say, oh, they have a $5,000 bankroll. Because originally they say they have a $500 bankroll. I say, no, you don't. How much are you willing to lose this year? I go, 5,000. Okay, so that is your bankroll. I said, if you play 5%, if you play 2% in GP and learn how to play or whatever like that, you could turn 5,000 into probably 15,000 by the end of the year. And the only difference between you and me is that I'm 6 years ahead of you. That's the only difference. If you learn all this, I'm not special or anything like that. But that's with having that type of goal. And I'd say 95% of people that I talk to don't have any. They have I have some disposable income, and I'm looking like, I'd love to make more money doing this. And they're like, well, how do I win that like this year? And I go, well, you have to learn how to turn 500 into 1,000 first. Then you have to learn to turn 1,000 into 2,000. And then once you start learning to do that, then it becomes easier and easier. But then you get to higher levels where you're dealing with people that know how to do that also. And now it's like, what are you comfortable with? And I think it is a realistic that this what I always try to not be like other people. I go, if you learn the concepts of DFS, you don't need a model. You don't need to simulate stuff. Probably need to subscribe somewhere to get projections and ownership. Said simply that, and doing content and learning just basic statistical concepts, game theory concepts, that the games, even now in 2022, are beatable enough that whether you decide to play head-to-heads, large field contests, small field contests, different sports, showdown, tiers, whatever, there's enough of an edge that if you are truly serious about it, you could get to the point where you're making $50,000 a year without that much of a, oh my God, I lost $10,000 this week type of swings. That if people were in that realistic zone, like DFS could actually be fun and profitable and not as stressful. And I think people just get outside of that zone way too much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things I respect about you is that like I think a lot of people, and this has been talked about before, like see these screenshots worth 100K or whatever and think, oh, this person's up over 100K on the
A
year
lot
or
of times
whatever.
they're
But
down.
right, exactly. And so I generally agree with your premise here. I think it's certainly possible still in this environment to make some money for most people playing DFS if they sort of start slowly and really I think that the biggest opportunity I see it in DFS is not even turning into what I would consider like a better player, but just picking better types of contests and sports to play. I mean, I think you said it earlier is that almost all your edge comes from when people make mistakes, and it's really beneficial if someone's making a mistake and you're in a. It's way more valuable if someone's making a mistake and you're in a say head to head than if you're in a 20,000 person contest. So and that there's a continuum there. So if you're able to find sports where a bunch of casuals who just enter the small contests like that, that's really valuable. And honestly, that's more of what I focus on. I think I spend more time trying to find good games in different sports, and then we'll try and I don't basically build a model and then start playing the sport. I will like try and understand the lobby and what's going on before I would build a model and then go from there, because there are some sports where the only people in the lobby are for example soccer. Like I'm not going to build a soccer model. I think highly not that I know them, but I know the people that are in those lobbies are very sharp, have been playing there for a very long time, and it doesn't seem like there's many casual people coming in. So that's like something I would avoid. But there's other sports that aren't necessarily like that. And, some of the smaller contests, it's easier, 3 mans, 4 mans, 10 mans, it's easier to manage and just like actually spend your time understanding people's lineups and what they're going to do. Now, that's not nearly as fun, say, as, building lineups and stuff. But reality, at least in my opinion, is that's where for people who are not trying to make, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, who want to make this a hobby or something where more reasonable, in the tens of thousands of dollars a year, somewhere in there. I think it's somewhat attainable to do, just sort of finding good games and getting good at them and building from there. So I totally agree with you, and wish more sites, touts, whatever would talk about like realistic ROIs, realistic how much money you can actually make, like to sell it, to sell it to someone who bets $100 a night that they're going to make $100,000 and share screenshots and something. I think is pretty disingenuous. So like I just it's pretty easy when you do how much you're betting times what like a realistic ROI is. It's how much you could actually make, but that's obviously not very sexy to most people. So I
Right.
think it's hard to
Right. No,
sell
no
subs that
double up
way.
screenshots. Imagine if I did the double up screenshots. Look, I turned 400 into 800.
You should have posted your screenshot of when you had whatever 4 people and 3 you duped or whatever. That should have been the screenshot.
We still have
Didn't
another
come in last.
tiebreaker. We still have another tiebreaker.
Oh my gosh.
Me and Mock
They're
Love are
just gonna
tied again for second place in a 2 man and a 4 man. So now we have to play a baseball slate. And you know what the worst part about that is? I know
you're gonna
exactly
do it.
what lineup he's going to play. I mean, like that's it's the DraftKings person. I don't know what's going to happen because I know what lineup he's going to play tomorrow night. It's going to be a 15 game MLB slate, and this dude from DraftKings who's setting up this third tiebreaker is going, okay, play an MLB 15 game slate. Whoever wins this slate gets the last round 2 ticket. and then it's going to be a 15 game slate. And we're both going to have the same exact lineup, and the guy's going to go, "What the fuck's going on?" Like, and then
Maybe
go,
he's
"Oh, we'll set it up for Wednesday. Well, tomorrow then will be contest, and we'll have the same lineup again." I'll go, "Tell me what's going to happen when the MMS slate is coming up on Saturday, and you've already run 17 tiebreakers that we've already duplicated 17 times. Like, they're gonna have what they're gonna think is that we're both the same person,
you're
right?
gonna get your account banned
Right.
for.
Both. Well, maybe that'd be good if I could get McLovin's account banned because of that. That'll help a lot of people out.
I think, yeah, it seems like it's gonna take more than that, but yeah, maybe he's been slow rolling you, and he's gonna break out his like real projection source. Maybe he's duping you.
No, he's not. Well, just like in MMA, we both played the out of the four people, we both played the highest projected optimal with every. I mean, two people didn't. Right, one person got a ceiling Parisian score instead of playing Rachmaninoff, and that outscored him. And one guy lost with Vieira, and he was out. And yeah,
Sounds
so
like it's gonna come down to a coin flip.
at this point, maybe. I mean, because it from a game theory perspective, do I have anything to lose by not playing the projected optimal?
If you also agree it's the projected optimal, yeah.
Right.
The one thing you could do is sometimes, again, going to simulation, sometimes a lineup that's projected higher doesn't actually win more than 50% of the time. So I don't know because just based on distributions and stuff. So I don't know if that's the case, but there could be a potential. I don't do or MLB sims,
Right.
but probably not. I wouldn't. Yeah, I wouldn't. I would play what you think is
What
the
I think
most
is
likely
what
to
I think is
win.
the optimal line, right? Which
Yeah,
is going to be the same projected optimal as that he's going to play.
you're in that lineup sharing chat
Yes, it's
together.
the
Is that
collusion chat,
okay?
of course.
The collusion. That's right.
The
Sorry,
collusion chat.
got it. Yeah, I would
uh,
just keep playing that, and it's gonna come down to a coin flip. It sounds like.
right, but you're not in any chats or anything.
No, honestly, this is like I have basically no DFS friends.
So this is the
None
first
of my
conversation you've ever had about DFS.
Yeah, honestly, that's basically true. I mean, I've briefly mentioned it to some of my friends, but none of them really play. I don't really have. I have the Twitter, but I
You
converse
you
with a couple
converse with
people.
people on Twitter. You're somewhat social.
Yeah, I have a couple, but I certainly don't like talk daily about strategy or results. And yeah, this is the first conversation I've really had with anybody DFS wise. So
Okay. Are we
appreciate
friends
you
now?
having me on.
Can we consider ourselves friends?
I think so. What about 3 hours later? I
Yeah.
think we can consider
I'm gonna
ourselves
call.
friends.
You're gonna be called the man without a face.
That is
I could see your
I,
face, but no one else can.
well, I'm sorry you had to see this for the
No,
entirety.
I
At
don't know
least
why. I don't know why. The man. That's the title of the episode. The man without a face.
wow, it's
Yeah.
gonna make it sound really mysterious.
Right. And it doesn't matter. No one could search for you or anything like that because we're using your middle name, and there's no photo. The man of mystery, the actuary. That it's an actuary by day and some superhero by night or something. The man without a face.
Bad MMA sims by night.
Right. So sports underscore PROJ. Did someone already had the first underscore and you had to get the second one?
I would have to think yes. I don't. Clearly, my SEO is pretty bad, but yeah, I would have to think that was the case. I don't know why I would have done two underscores.
Right, because it looks like in the beginning I thought it's like sports underscore projections. Like nope, Scott sports underscore proj. And sports-projections.com if you if you want to check your dupes and take especially the showdown contest and you don't have an easy way of doing that, pay $8. Originally it was free, but I'm assuming you put a little paywall on it for two reasons. One, make a little money, and two, a lot of people are using it.
Yeah, I think it's really not about the money. I don't make nearly enough money that it would ever probably make it worth it. Honestly, for me, it was about making me care about it a little bit more and maintain it and make it a little bit better. If I have actual people who are paying for it, I'll service it a little bit better. I think I made it paywalled when I incorporated like the actual inclusion of salary and information like that, which needs to sort of pool daily from DraftKings. So that's one reason. The other reason is I just like to learn new skills and stuff. So my website is not the fanciest, but trying to figure out how to work that all. Figure
Okay.
it can't hurt me in the long run.
Right. Well, you got $8 from me.
I can retire happy now.
Right. Well, that maybe the only money you'll ever make from me in DFS.
I probably doesn't pay for the losses. It's
Well, I don't know what
slightly
content. I
off.
don't know. I don't even know what you're playing. You're not playing the soccer lobby, so I pretty much don't have a shot.
I play MMA. You've taken some money out of. Well, I don't know if you've. I've only been playing for like a month or two, so I don't know if you've taken any money out since then from MMA.
Well, I
But
mean, that's equity. I mean, we're not playing like head to head or anything.
no, right, no, yeah, I just mean out of the pool generally. No,
Right.
I don't know if we've ever played head to head. Probably not.
Right.
I think we play very different sports.
Ah, okay. So sports-projections.com, sports__project, If you're here on YouTube, you've been watching just me as a floating head and some other person and just an invisible person talking. But the whole point, this is a podcast. This is audio form. I just throw it up on YouTube because people apparently like searching for stuff and watching. I don't know why you'd watch two heads talking for 3 hours, but you are. Give it a thumbs up if you're here. And as always, the theory of daily fantasy sports. 15-hour audio DFS masterclass. You can pick up at theoryofdfs.com.